Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural happenings, even after 2 decades on the force, sitting through endless 911 calls that turned out to be nothing more than nervous hallucinations, overactive imaginations, or simply the manifestation of grief. But the night it happened in Pine Ridge still haunts me, and every time I think back to it, a chill crawls down my spine. I remember it was a bitterly cold October evening, the kind of night where the wind howled just a bit too loudly through the leafless trees, and the streetlights flickered uncertainly over cracked sidewalks. I was on a late-night patrol along Maple Street, a quiet residential stretch in one of those small towns that remind you of a bygone era when the world felt simpler and the rules were clear. The radio crackled with the usual dispatch chatter, 10-4, Unit 142 responding, and the clock on my dashboard read 11:38 p.m. It was then that the call came through, a fractured, trembling voice on the other end of the line reporting something that didn't fit the norm. The dispatcher's tone was clipped as she repeated, "Unit 142, we have a 1050 at 27 Maple Street in Pine Ridge. Caller reports he's back and needs an immediate welfare check." I couldn't help but notice the pause in her voice, a hesitancy that spoke of something more than just an overactive imagination. When I arrived, the neighborhood lay under a quilt of uneasy silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of a refrigerator or the creak of an old porch swing. The house at 27 Maple Street was a modest, well-maintained structure with a neatly trimmed lawn and a small porch light flickering in the persistent gusts of autumn wind. I knocked and was greeted at the door by a fragile-looking woman in a faded floral nightgown. Her silver hair, pinned back in a disheveled bun, betrayed the passage of time, and her eyes were wide and haunted, as if forever scanning for a presence no one else could see. "Thank you for coming, officer," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the persistent background noise of her rattling teapot on the counter. I didn't know who else to call. He's back." Her words, stumbling out between shaky breaths, were laced with a mix of terror and a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull at the edges of my very being. I stepped inside the dimly lit entryway, the smell of old lavender and dust mingling in the cool air. In the living room, with its threadbare carpet and a faded portrait of a man in military uniform hanging askew on the wall, she motioned for me to sit. I pulled out my notebook, my senses on high alert as I tried to pick up every nuance of her speech. "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what you mean by 'he's back'?" I asked slowly, careful not to disturb the heavy silence that enveloped the room. Her eyes shifted nervously to a corner of the room before she began haltingly. It's my husband. He passed away 5 years ago, but every night, every single night for the past week, he's been standing at the edge of my bed." Her voice faltered for a moment as she wrung her hands together, and the faint sound of a ticking clock filled the silent gaps between her words. I noted every detail. The slight tremor in her voice, the way she'd clutch a chipped porcelain teacup as if it were a lifeline. And, instinctively, I activated my radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 142. I've spoken with the caller at 27 Maple Street, Pine Ridge. Copy that it's a welfare check for an elderly female claiming her deceased husband is present. Requesting backup for further assessment. Over." The dispatcher replied in a curt monotone, "Unit 142, copy that. Backup en route. Code 3 if necessary, over. As I waited, I took a closer look around. The living room was sparsely furnished. A threadbare sofa, a couple of chairs, a television that hadn't been serviced in years, and each object whispered secrets of a life long past. At precisely 11:42 p.m., the sound of approaching sirens in the distance signaled that reinforcement was on its way. I decided to lead her to the bedroom, the place she identified as the stage for these nightly visitations. The corridor was narrow, its wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the only light came from a single bulb that swung slightly as I moved. The bedroom was the heart of the mystery. The air was noticeably colder here, the atmosphere thick with anticipation, as if the very room held its breath waiting for something to emerge. The bed was made with a precision that contrasted starkly with the otherwise lived-in disarray of the house. He stands right there," she murmured, pointing a trembling hand toward the headboard. I stepped closer, my senses straining to detect any anomaly, any sign of movement or warmth that might explain her terror. But in the dim illumination, nothing stirred except the shadows. I radioed again. "Dispatch, this is 142, I'm in the subject's bedroom. No visible signs of intruder or disturbance. Advise if I should conduct a full search. Over." A brief pause ensued before the dispatcher replied, 142, that's a 10-4. Continue with a visual and olfactory examination of the area. Maintain caution. Over. I examined the bed, the nightstand, the windowsill where frost had begun to accumulate despite the indoor heating, and even the patterned rug that lay in front of the bed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary except for the pervasive chill that clung to the air. "Ma'am, do you see anything that might indicate a break-in?" I gently asked, though deep inside I suspected the answer was far from simple. Her eyes, red-rimmed from tears, met mine, and she shook her head vigorously. "No, nothing," she said, as if trying to convince herself as much as me. I took down some notes, detailing every observation, down to the way the old analog clock on the bedside table ticked away the seconds, each one a reminder of time slipping by. As I turned to leave the room and confer with my backup, the radio suddenly crackled to life with a brief, urgent message from the dispatcher. "Unit 142, be advised, subject's daughter, Tammy, is on her way to the residence. She's reported that her mother has been under a lot of stress and has been hearing things again. Repeat, under a lot of stress. Over." I acknowledged with a measured 10-4 and stepped back into the living room, my mind racing through possible scenarios. Could this be a manifestation of grief, an auditory hallucination born of isolation and fear? Or was there something else, something unexplainable lurking at the edge of reality? I stayed with the elderly woman for nearly another half hour, giving her updates on the arrival of additional units and speaking with her in a calm, even tone, hoping to alleviate her mounting anxiety. Her description of her husband was both tender and disturbing. She recalled the gentle timbre of his voice, the soft click of his cufflinks, the way he would lean over her in bed, looking at her with a gaze that mingled affection with something far more ominous. Each word she spoke was punctuated by the harsh sound of her own breathing, and each pause was a silent testament to the terror that had gripped her for days. When my partner finally arrived, a seasoned officer with a steady demeanor and a knack for piecing together the oddest of puzzles, I briefed him on the situation, and together we conducted a more thorough search of the premises. We followed every lead, the narrow attic, the creaking cellar, even the small porch area where the wind roared through gaps in the wood. Yet, despite our efforts, we found nothing that could explain her claims. I remember ending that initial visit with an unshakable sense of disquiet. As we drove away in our unmarked cruiser, the radio remained filled with scattered chatter, check-ins from dispatch, code updates, and even a brief, half-hearted exchange about the latest weather report. Outside, the temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the beam of the dashboard light. The case was logged, the report written with painstaking detail, and promises made to follow up. Yet, as I sat in silence during the long drive back to headquarters, I couldn't escape the feeling that the night was far from over, that something more was lurking in the shadows of Pine Ridge. Backup units arrived, and canvassing began in earnest the following morning. The overcast skies offered little hope of sunlight breaking the oppressive gloom. I was on duty again that afternoon, dressed in my standard-issue blue uniform with a badge that seemed to weigh heavier that day, and returned to 27 Maple Street to check on the circumstances of the call, now that morning light had offered a harsher, clearer view of the scene. The house was eerily silent and abandoned in its own sorrow. The caller, Miss Carter, was found lifeless in her bed, her eyes wide in a frozen expression of both terror and resignation. A single handwritten note lay on the bedside table, its message chillingly succinct. "He's here for me now." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I replayed her words in my mind, the tremor in her voice, the finality of the scene. The forensic team methodically combed the room for any evidence of foul play or intrusion, but nothing seemed amiss. The window was locked, the door showed no signs of forced entry, and yet the atmosphere was charged with a menace that defied logical explanation. In our debriefing, the sergeant insisted that I file a supplemental report detailing every nuance of that night. I sat there, recounting in measured tones the dispatch codes, the routine procedures, and the eerie, lingering presence I had felt in that cold bedroom. It was all written down meticulously, a record that would eventually become one of those cases that officers refer to in hushed tones when the night grows inexplicably still. I couldn't shake the growing obsession with finding answers. Over the next several days, I pored over every detail of the report, re-interviewed witnesses, and revisited the scene with an eye for something that everyone else had missed. My partner, Officer Daniels, a tough, pragmatic man who preferred facts over feelings, warned me not to get too caught up in what could easily be explained away by grief or mental fragility. "You're chasing ghosts, Cole," he said one rainy afternoon, as we sat in the squad car near the diner on Route 12. I shrugged, but inside I knew there was something more to it, something that defied mundane explanations. Late one night, at approximately 1:17 a.m., I found myself returning to 27 Maple Street once more, drawn back by a need for closure that had morphed into an obsession. The town was nearly asleep. The only sound was the steady patter of rain on the pavement, and the distant rumble of a freight train. With my flashlight in hand and my gun secured at my side, I retraced my steps to the house. The porch light was off now, unlike the frantic glow the previous night, and the door creaked open as if inviting me back into the space that held all the unanswered questions of that dreadful case. Inside, the house was silent and oppressive, each room a mausoleum of memories. I moved slowly, every creak of the floorboard echoing like a whispered secret. The living room was empty, the furniture draped in heavy shadows, and there was no sign that life had been disturbed since the previous night. I made my way back to the bedroom, the air growing colder as I approached. The bed was still made with that unnervingly careful precision, and on the nightstand sat the note, now faded, yet the words, "He's here for me now," remained unmistakably clear. I stood for several long minutes, simply absorbing the palpable atmosphere of despair and dread that hung over the room. Every instinct screamed that I was intruding upon something meant to be left untouched. At one point, as I was about to leave, a soft sound, a mere whisper of fabric, caused my heart to skip a beat. I turned sharply toward the source but saw nothing. The overwhelming quiet was then punctured by what sounded like a distant murmur, almost like someone speaking in hushed, desperate tones, reciting words that I couldn't quite make out over the pounding of my own heart. The radio, which had been silent since my last check-in with dispatch, suddenly crackled with static, and I could almost swear I heard a voice in the background, calling out a code I hadn't heard in years. 1050. Over. I froze, my breath shallow and rapid, as a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Had it been a trick of the mind, a hallucination born of too many sleepless nights, or was it something more? As I gathered my composure and stepped out into the sodden darkness, a final glance at the house left me with an indelible impression of having witnessed something that defied explanation. I radioed back to headquarters with a terse 10-4, 27 Maple Street. Resolved area clear, returning to base. But even as I drove away, the questions persisted, echoing in the recesses of my mind like a dissonant refrain. That night, as the rain hammered relentlessly against the windshield, I couldn't help but wonder if the case was truly closed, or if I had merely scratched the surface of something far more sinister. The days that followed were filled with a palpable tension that seemed to coalesce around every dark corner of Pine Ridge. I attended follow-up interviews, rechecked logs, and even sought out the daughter, Tammy, who had arrived at the home shortly after her mother's death. Tammy's expression was one of numb resignation, as if she had long since surrendered to the inexplicable fate that had befallen her family. Over a cup of weak coffee at the local precinct, she recounted her mother's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to that fateful night. Mom would sit there for hours, staring at the empty space by her bed, she said in a monotone that made my stomach churn. She always said he was watching her. Always watching. Her words, spoken in such a flat, detached manner, only deepened the unsettling aura surrounding the case. My colleagues and I mulled over the evidence late into the night at the station, our weary minds grappling with the dual nature of what we had witnessed: the undeniable loss of a life touched by grief, and the inexplicable feeling of a presence that seemed too real to be mere imagination. I spent countless hours reviewing the video footage from nearby traffic cameras, scrutinizing every frame in the hope of finding something, a shadow, a flicker, that might validate Miss Carter's claims. But all I found was the lingering static of a cold, indifferent night, the sort that leaves you questioning whether the line between reality and the inexplicable has ever truly been drawn in stone. Every measured step, every whispered radio transmission, every cautious conversation between fellow officers became a fragment of a puzzle that refused to reveal its full picture. That sense of relentless inquiry, that drive to piece together every oddity of that long night in Pine Ridge, ultimately led me down a path I never intended to walk. A path where facts and folklore began to blur, and where the comforting boundaries of the rational mind gave way to a creeping dread that nothing in our blueprints of duty could ever fully explain. There's a memory I can't erase. Sitting in my patrol car in the dead hours of the morning after my third visit to the scene, my hands trembling as I recounted the details into my recorder. "This is Officer Cole," I began in a voice that wavered despite my resolve, "and I'm relaying what I witnessed at 27 Maple Street." The temperature dropped markedly inside the residence, and there was a pervasive chill that seemed almost deliberate, as if the space itself were aware of my intrusion. I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I'm not sure if it's my mind playing tricks after so many sleepless nights, or if I'm staring into a truth that's too vast for us to comprehend. Over. I replayed the recording over and over, each listen dredging up the phantoms of that night. Every rational explanation seemed to crumble under the weight of what I had seen and felt. My partner, Daniels, maintained his cautious skepticism, insisting that the mind often fashions answers out of grief. Yet even he could not deny the lingering unease that crept into his eyes whenever he mentioned that house. The case was eventually closed as a tragic instance of elderly distress compounded by severe mental strain, a conclusion that, while administratively neat, left an open wound in the collective memory of our department. The file was archived under Unresolved Occurrences, a small, unassuming folder that now sits on my desk as a permanent reminder of the night when reality itself felt unmoored. I tried to move on, immersing myself in routine calls and mundane cases, but the unease never left me. The whispers of that cold October night and the persistent echo of a code that shouldn't have been there continued to reverberate in the quiet moments between shifts. I've attended therapy sessions, had long conversations with colleagues about the metaphysical boundaries of our world, and even revisited my own records in search of anomalies that might parallel what happened at 27 Maple Street. But the truth remains as slippery as ever, a melding of loss, rumor, and something otherworldly that our standard investigative protocols simply can't measure. It wasn't until nearly a month later, on a gloomy, rain-soaked evening, that a new twist surfaced. The precinct's technician called me into his cluttered, dimly lit office, a space filled with outdated monitors and filing cabinets crammed with decades of case records. "Officer Cole," he said, his tone careful but excited, "I've been reviewing some old dispatch recordings, and I found something that might interest you." He played me a snippet of radio chatter dating back to the night in question. A few seconds of static interspersed with a hushed command, barely audible but unmistakably present. 10:50, over. I listened repeatedly, each playback sending shivers down my spine. How could that message have been broadcast if there was no one else on duty except the dispatchers, who were following strict protocols? The implication was unnerving. Someone, somewhere, had intercepted that code, or perhaps spoken it under conditions we couldn't fathom. That revelation ignited a new fervor in me, a determination to understand what lurked beyond our conventional explanations. I began to compile every scrap of evidence, every single detail from dispatch logs, body camera footage, and even statements from local residents who recalled a strange, foreboding presence near the house in the days following Ms. Carter's passing. The deeper I dug, the more the boundary between the tangible world and the realm of inexplicable phenomena blurred. There were whispers among retired officers of a similar incident decades ago, an occurrence involving an elderly woman in a remote area who claimed that her deceased husband had come back to watch over her, only for her to be found lifeless with a cryptic note left behind. Though such accounts were dismissed as folklore and the desperate fabrication of a fragile mind, the details bore uncanny resemblance to what I had witnessed. As I stand here now, recounting this story into the recorder with trembling fingers and a mind heavy with unresolved questions, I'm haunted by the cold truth that perhaps some mysteries are never meant to be understood. The case remains locked in that unyielding twilight between grief and the inexplicable, a stark reminder that even in our modern age, where science and procedure rule, there are depths of human experience that defy reason. That night in Pine Ridge wasn't just another call on my log. It was an encounter with the shadows that lingered just beyond the reach of our everyday understanding. An encounter that continues to whisper its unsettling refrain in the silence of my long, sleepless nights. And so, as the rain begins anew outside my window and I listen to the distant patter echoing through the quiet precinct halls, I'm left with a single, disquieting question. Was that night a tragic misinterpretation born of grief and isolation? Or did I truly glimpse something someone, beyond the veil of life and death. The evidence is scattered like fragments of shattered glass, each piece a reminder that in the world of law enforcement, some calls aren't just about duty or protocol. They're about confronting a reality that is as hauntingly beautiful as it is terrifying. There are nights when I lie awake, the memory of that encounter replaying in my mind, and I wonder if I should ever have returned to that house in Pine Ridge. Each flash of memory is accompanied by the echo of that ghostly radio message, and the unmistakable chill that whispered, "He's here for me now." It lingers in my mind, a constant, inescapable presence, leaving me to question. In our line of work, when the darkness stretches long and the night speaks in codes, could it be that our world is not so neatly divided between the living and those who have passed on? I still don't have the answer, and sometimes I fear that some truths are better left unsaid, locked away in the silent corridors of a forgotten house on Maple Street. A month has passed since that fateful night, yet every time I step into the precinct or drive down a deserted road, I can't help but remember the chilling dialogue, the trembling voice of a woman who believed she had seen her long-lost husband standing in the glow of a cold bedside lamp. And as the days blend into one long, relentless recollection, the unanswered question gnaws at me. What truly happened in that house? I'm left wondering if the darkness itself reached out and stole a piece of our reality, leaving behind a lingering, malevolent presence that no amount of police work or logical deduction can ever fully dispel. I record these thoughts not for sensationalism, but in the hope that someday someone else may come across this record and find the courage to ask the same question that continues to haunt my every quiet moment. Was what I experienced real, or was it the ephemeral phantom of a mind strained by the endless burden of duty and loss? As I sign off for the night, one final thought remains, a question that drifts unanswered like a ghost in the dark corridors of memory, leaving an unsettling uncertainty. Maybe, just maybe, some calls on the 911 line are more than just tragic miscommunications. And sometimes the truth is something far more inexplicable than we are ever meant to understand. It was nearly 3 weeks later, on a frigid November evening, when a new series of events began to unfold, sending shockwaves through our small town and reopening old wounds I'd fought so hard to bury. I was working the graveyard shift. The digital clock on my dashboard showed 2:03 a.m. as I patrolled the winding roads of Pine Ridge. The weather was bitter. Rain was slanting down in razor-thin sheets, and the wind was so fierce that it seemed to carry the distant echoes of a past I had long tried to forget. My thoughts were still on 27 Maple Street, on the inexplicable chill and the ghostly radio transmission that had haunted my previous nights. At that moment, the radio buzzed urgently. Unit 142. We have a 1050 at 27 Maple Street. Code urgent, over. My heart skipped. I couldn't believe the call was coming again, as if the house itself was beckoning me back into its fold of unresolved mysteries. I swung the cruiser around with a mix of dread and determination, the wipers struggling against the furious downpour. As I drove, I mentally reviewed every detail of the earlier encounter. The hurried interview with Miss Carter, her trembling admission, the unnerving silence that had followed my departure, and that ghostly command in the static. My partner, Daniels, had since been reassigned to a different shift after quietly expressing his concern about the toll the case was taking on us. Now, I was alone on this call. Alone with a duty that felt more like a personal summons. Pulling up to Maple Street once more, I noted that the house looked even more forlorn under the weight of the storm. The porch light, which had once sputtered with a dim, uncertain glow, was now completely off, swallowed by the deluge of rain. As I stepped out of the cruiser, the radio remained silent for a few agonizing seconds. the only sound being the relentless drumming of water on the asphalt and the distant rumble of thunder. I adjusted my vest, checked my sidearm, and approached the front door with cautious steps, my footsteps echoing off the slick concrete. "Dispatch, this is Unit 142. I'm on scene at 27 Maple Street. Visual is unclear. Proceeding with caution." "Over," I murmured into the radio, my voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside me. The door creaked open slowly when I knocked, and the interior of the house was shrouded in darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom in uneven, jittery sweeps. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the periodic hiss of wind seeping through ill-fitted windows and the drip of water from an unseen leak. I called out in a low, firm tone, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. A figure stirred in the far corner of the narrow hallway. A shape I first assumed was a trick of the light or a stray curtain flailing in the wind. As I approached, my mind raced with possibilities. Had I arrived too late to prevent another tragedy? Had the house become a beacon for something beyond human comprehension? I recalled the note from Miss Carter's final moments, a desperate, almost prophetic message left behind. The air inside was bitterly cold, and my breath formed visible puffs as I moved deeper into the house. Every step carried the weight of memories, both mine and those of the woman whose final days were shrouded in inexplicable phenomena. The living room was unchanged from my last visit. The threadbare sofa, the old-fashioned television set, the portrait that still hung crookedly on the wall. But now, every object seemed to carry a new, eerie significance, a silent witness to a story that refused to end. I could almost feel eyes on me, as if the very walls retained the echoes of Miss Carter's anguished pleas and the enigmatic presence that had tormented her. I took slow, careful notes on my digital recorder, my hand trembling as I recounted every detail for what felt like a mission to capture the unfathomable. "This is Officer Cole reporting live from 27 Maple Street. The atmosphere is heavy, laden with a foreboding that I cannot shake. I feel as though I'm being watched, as though the darkness itself has taken on a life of its own. There's an unmistakable chill in the air, a cold that seeps into the bones and whispers secrets of despair." My words hung in the stillness, merging with the sound of the storm. I advanced toward the hallway that led to the bedroom, where so many of Miss Carter's memories and fears resided. Every detail was etched in my mind. The meticulously made bed, the faded floral pattern of the drapes, the way the corridor's dim light seemed to recede into an endless tunnel. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, inviting yet forbidding. I paused for a long moment before pushing it open and stepping inside. The room was exactly as I had left it on that earlier night, cold, sterile, and pregnant, with a silence that screamed of a lingering presence. I advanced toward the nightstand where the note lay. As I reached out to pick it up, the hairs on the back of my neck rose in protest. The note, now even more weathered, bore the same chilling inscription in shaky handwriting. "He's here for me now." My mind reeled with conflicting emotions, duty, dread, and a deep-seated need to unearth the truth. In the periphery, I noticed something odd, a slight movement in the shadows near the window. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing across the room in rapid, uneven arcs. For a split second, it seemed as though a dark figure had flitted behind the curtain, a figure that vanished just as quickly as it appeared. I called out once more, "Show yourself!" But the only response was the sound of the storm and my own labored breathing. In that charged silence, I reached for my radio to update dispatch, my voice barely keeping pace with the rising panic. "Dispatch, Unit 142 again. I'm in the bedroom at 27 Maple Street. I believe I detected movement near the window, requesting immediate backup for a continued scene assessment. Over. The reply was brief, a curt, measured 10-4, Unit 142. Additional units en route. Stand by and maintain safety protocols. Over. Yet, even as I waited, every instinct in me screamed that I was no longer alone in that haunted space. I began a meticulous re-examination of the room, running my gloved fingers over the surface of the nightstand, checking behind the mirror, the closet door, and even the baseboard where creaks and whispers seemed to emanate from unseen corners. With each step, I felt a suffocating pressure build, as though the room itself was converging, closing in. The storm outside had reached a crescendo. The wind howled, and the rain lashed out in relentless fury, punctuating the isolation of that eerie domicile. I could almost feel the spectral weight of an unseen presence observing me, its gaze heavier than any human's could be. Then, amid that mounting terror, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound that resembled a sigh, or perhaps the murmur of a conversation too distant to decipher. It came from near the bed where I had last seen the note. I crouched and steadied my breathing, the tension in my muscles taut like piano wires. The recorder in my hand continued to capture every nuance. The low murmur of the storm, my own shallow breaths, and that elusive sound, as if someone or something were speaking just beyond the reach of normal hearing. "He's here for me now," the note insisted. And now the room itself seemed to echo that sentiment in a whisper that vibrated in my very bones. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in time and terror, but eventually the sound faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence that resonated with unanswered questions. I left the room, my mind reeling and my senses on high alert, stepping back into the corridor where the weight of every unsolved mystery pressed in around me. In that moment, with the storm raging outside and my heart pounding in my ears, I felt an overwhelming realization. The events at 27 Maple Street were far from a simple case of elderly delusion or grief-induced hallucination. Something far more complex, something that defied the neat categories of police reports and forensic analysis, had woven itself into the fabric of that house, and perhaps into the very soul of Pine Ridge. I returned to the cruiser with a heavy heart and an even heavier duty to relay the events as they unfolded, to document every chilling detail for a case that, by all rational accounts, should have been closed weeks ago. My report was filled with standardized language. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of physical disturbance, and yet a pronounced sense of an intangible presence. But even as I filed it, I knew that no matter how meticulously I cataloged every observation, or how rigorously I adhered to standard police protocols, the case would forever elude definitive explanation. Back at headquarters that night, I sat in a cramped interrogation room turned makeshift evidence lab, replaying the recordings and cross-referencing the dispatch logs. The station was nearly empty at that hour, a few officers huddled over coffee, and a waning sense of fatigue filling the air. I shared my findings with the sergeant, who maintained a measured tone as he advised, "Officer Cole, you need to take a step back." Sometimes the mind plays tricks on us, especially after prolonged stress. I tried to argue that it wasn't just stress, that the evidence, the inexplicable radio transmission, the presence I felt near the window, pointed to something otherworldly. But the sergeant's eyes, reflecting years of experience and many unsolvable cases, simply said it all without words. Some mysteries have no answers that fit neatly within our standard protocols. I spent the remainder of the night reviewing witness statements, dispatch logs, and even local historical archives. There were records, older, nearly forgotten records, of similar occurrences in remote pockets of America, cases dismissed as mere urban legends. These accounts described hearing phantom voices, experiencing an unexplainable drop in temperature, and feeling an overwhelming, inexplicable presence in homes left behind by those who had suffered immense loss. The parallels with the events at Maple Street were too stark to ignore. I documented everything: names, dates, details, all interwoven into a tapestry of grief, loss, and the uncanny boundary between our world and whatever lay beyond. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to subside, a new record was added to my growing dossier of the inexplicable. I left the station with a mind full of questions and a heart burdened by the realization that the darkness I had encountered that night might be something not easily cast out by the bright light of day. The silence of Pine Ridge, with its familiar streets and weathered homes, now carried an undercurrent of despair and mystery that I knew would forever change the way I saw the world. Even now, I record these events in the quiet moments after a long shift, when the world seems to pause and the only sound is the steady tick of a clock marking the passage of time. I wonder if I'll ever be free of the questions that plague me, if I'll ever be able to forget that ghostly code crackling in the static, or the glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye urging me to uncover truths that were never meant to be known. As I sign off this entry, I'm left with that disquieting thought, a thought that echoes in every silent moment, every rainy night on a deserted street. What if some calls on the 911 line are not merely accidents of the mind, but doorways to a realm where grief, loss, and the inexplicable coexist in a state of perpetual unrest? In the weeks that followed, the case of 27 Maple Street began to seep into every corner of our lives, infiltrating the mundane rhythms of daily duty with an unrelenting sense of dread and uncertainty. Pine Ridge, a town long accustomed to the predictable cadence of small-town life, now seemed cloaked in a persistent aura of foreboding. I found myself haunted by the fragmented memories of that stormy night, the low murmur of a voice just beyond the reach of reason, the cold, unwavering presence that seemed to linger long after the storm had passed. At the precinct, as I sat across from Detective Harris, a grizzled veteran with deep lines etched into his face from decades of witnessing humanity's darkest moments, we delved into the minutiae of the case once more. "Officer Cole," Harris began in a rough, gravelly voice, "I've gone over every scrap of evidence you submitted. The scene, the dispatch logs, even that damn radio transmission. There's something in your report that I can't put my finger on." His eyes, sharp and unyielding despite his age, locked onto mine. It's not the usual kind of grief-fueled delusion we see in these cases. There's a resonance to it, a repetition of details that suggests this may not be an isolated incident. I nodded silently, recalling the old archives and the whispered accounts of similar occurrences from decades ago. Harris continued, "I'm pulling up records from the local historical society. There was another incident back in 1978 in the neighboring town of Cedar Hollow. An elderly woman, a similar note, inexplicable phenomena. It's almost as if these incidents are part of a continuum, something that transcends our normal understanding of the law." Over the following days, the investigation took on an almost obsessive quality. Harris and I pored over yellowed newspaper clippings, archival dispatch recordings, and even interviewed elderly residents who remembered whispers of events that, to them, were inexplicable apparitions of the past. I remember one interview in particular, an 82-year-old gentleman named Mr. Lewis, who recounted a story about a similarly tragic event that had occurred nearly 40 years ago. In his slow, measured speech, each word dripping with the weight of lived experience, he spoke of a house on Oakwood Lane, where a lady had complained for months about seeing her dead husband. The story, once dismissed as a figment of a senile mind, now resonated with our case in Pine Ridge. "Son, there's things in this world that don't fit in the neat boxes of human understanding," he'd murmured, his eyes distant and sorrowful. "Sometimes those we've lost, they don't always let go." Our efforts to find a rational explanation led us deep into the mechanics of our own system. Every detail was examined: the registry of dispatch calls, the maintenance logs of the analog radios still in use at the small town station, and even the weather reports from the National Weather Service, which confirmed that a sharp drop in temperature had indeed occurred in that particular neighborhood on the night in question. I recall sitting alone in the evidence room for hours, scanning through digital copies of meteorological data and cross-referencing them with the timeline of events. The correlation was undeniable: a precipitous drop in temperature, an atmosphere charged with static electricity, and then the haunting call from an elderly woman whose grief seemed too profound to be merely personal. Each piece of data lent the case an air of legitimacy that could not be easily dismissed as mere paranoia. Even as I compiled these facts, a part of me, a part that I struggled to keep at bay, began to wonder if some things were truly beyond our grasp. The protocols we follow, the codes we repeat over our radios, 10-4, 10-7, 10-50, and the rigid structure of our daily routines suddenly seemed insufficient to capture the full range of human experience. There were moments, in the dead silence of the night, when the line between duty and the supernatural blurred, and I found myself questioning whether our hard-won rationality was nothing more than a fragile veneer over a far more chaotic reality. Late one night, after a particularly long shift, I sat alone in my cluttered apartment, reading through the compiled evidence. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering light of a desk lamp and the pale glow of a clock that ticked relentlessly. Every now and then, I could almost swear I heard a faint whisper, as though the darkness itself was trying to speak to me. I recorded my thoughts on my digital recorder, my voice barely steady as I said, "This is Officer Cole, and I'm beginning to think that maybe we're dealing with something that defies conventional explanation. The evidence, while rooted in fact, also suggests an element, a presence, that seems to stalk the edges of our reality. I can't help but wonder, what if some of these calls are not just cries for help, but messages from a realm we have yet to comprehend?" I turned the recorder off and sat back, my eyes closing as exhaustion washed over me. But sleep did not come easily. Instead, my mind replayed the events of Maple Street in a torturous loop. A never-ending montage of whispered commands, cold touches of unseen hands, and the incessant echo of that final, bone-chilling note. Was it all a tragic confluence of grief and isolation, or was there a pattern, a hidden truth lying dormant beneath the veneer of mundane police work? I couldn't decide. Then, one evening, as I was leaving the precinct, I happened to pass by a small memorial wall dedicated to fallen officers and unsolved cases alike. Among the many names and brief inscriptions was one that sent a chill down my spine, a reference to an incident in Cedar Hollow nearly 40 years ago, with details that eerily mirrored the Pine Ridge case. I paused before the memorial, the cool night air swirling around me, and for a long, silent moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of countless unanswered questions. It was as if the past and present were speaking to each other in a language beyond words, reminding me that sometimes, no matter how diligently we search for answers, some mysteries remain forever veiled. I still don't know if that call on 27 Maple Street was a product of an unhinged mind steeped in grief, or if it was a doorway, however fleeting, to something that eludes our understanding of life and death. The investigation continues to echo in my memories, And as I write these words, I find myself asking the most disquieting question of all. In a world governed by codes, protocols, and rigid order, can we ever truly capture the essence of those moments when reality itself shatters, leaving us to wonder if the inexplicable is, in fact, the truest form of existence? The case remains unresolved, a dark stain on my record, an ever-present reminder that sometimes the darkness reaches out long after the call has ended, leaving behind whispers that we may never fully understand. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind perennially restless, I close this chapter of my recollection. But the story, the questions, and the eerie certainty that something beyond our realm might be watching remain. As the precinct lights dim and another shift is about to begin, I can't help but think, what if the next call isn't just a cry for help, but a call to witness an unimaginable truth? The silence that follows might just be the answer that leaves you questioning everything, even as you wonder, was it real, or should I have never listened at all? Now, months have passed since that fateful series of events, yet the spectral imprint of Pine Ridge endures. I find myself traveling far beyond the boundaries of our small town, summoned to investigate seemingly isolated incidents of the same nature. Reports of inexplicable presences, unsettling radio transmissions, and persistent accounts of eerie visitations in other corners of our region. In one such case, in a sleepy town in northern Georgia, an elderly gentleman, Mr. Franklin, called 911 in a state of sheer panic, insisting that someone was standing in his living room, watching him with eyes that burned with an intensity he had not seen since the days of his youth. The call bore an uncanny similarity to the Maple Street incident. As I arrived at Mr. Franklin's modest home on Birchwood Avenue, the echoes of that earlier case reverberated within me. The hour was 10:47 p.m., and the night was unusually still for autumn. A heavy mist enveloped the streets, reducing visibility to mere feet. I could almost feel an unspoken connection between that distant call and the unresolved mysteries of Pine Ridge. The scene in Mr. Franklin's house was disturbingly ordinary yet curiously layered with an oppressive melancholy. The living room was warm, yet dimly lit, the furniture arranged in familiar domestic order, and yet, in one quiet corner, a room lined with photographs of a happier past, Mr. Franklin claimed he felt an intense, chilling gaze fix upon him. "It's like he's watching me, like he hasn't left," Mr. Franklin said in a shaky tone as I began my investigation, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate yearning. I reassured him in the calm, measured cadence honed over my years of service. "I'm here to help, Mr. Franklin. We'll get to the bottom of this." But even as I spoke, the room seemed to pulse with the silent dread of an unseen presence, and I found myself instinctively checking the corners, the shadows beneath the furniture, as if expecting the specter of a long-lost loved one to materialize at any moment. I conducted a full sweep of the residence, relying on both my training and a heightened sense of intuition that had been sharpened by my experiences in Pine Ridge. Everything appeared normal. The windows were closed securely. There were no signs of forced entry, and all electronic devices were functioning as expected. Yet there was a subtle, almost imperceptible chill in the air, a cold that didn't belong to the warmth of a lived-in home. My hand hovered near the radio in my patrol car as I recorded my observations. "This is Officer Cole, on the scene at 51 Birchwood Avenue. The subject reports a persistent, inexplicable presence. There are no signs of intruders, yet a cold, almost palpable sensation pervades the atmosphere. I'm proceeding with all standard safety protocols and a full perimeter search." Over. The silence that followed was laden with more than just the absence of background chatter. It was thick with the weight of a mystery that refused to yield to reason. Over the next several days, I collaborated with local law enforcement, and even forensic specialists who were just as baffled as I was. Mr. Franklin's case seemed to be an odd, isolated echo of the events at Maple Street, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. Dispatch logs, once again, revealed the same disquieting pattern. Calls made in desperation with cryptic language, the invocation of phrases that, to the trained ear, carried an eerie resonance. I began cross-referencing these new incidents with the archived records from Pine Ridge and Cedar Hollow, piecing together a puzzle that spanned decades and defied conventional investigative techniques. Every account, every recorded 10 to 50 transmission, and every whispered recollection in the dim light of a police briefing room contributed to a growing narrative. A narrative in which the boundaries of grief, memory, and the supernatural blurred into one indistinct, unsettling tapestry. One chilly afternoon, I returned to the scene at Birchwood Avenue alone, determined to capture anything that might have been missed in the initial investigation. The house was quiet, the only sound the muted drip of rain from the eaves and the creaking of ancient wood. I retraced my steps, methodically checking every room, every shadowed corner. It was then, in the near-empty attic filled with dusty memorabilia and forgotten relics of a bygone era, that I discovered a collection of old photographs and handwritten letters. They chronicled the life of Mr. Franklin's late wife, a woman remembered for her gentle smile and unwavering devotion. One faded letter, in particular, caught my eye. A letter that spoke of the inexplicable feeling of being watched, of love that persisted beyond death's finality. The handwriting was delicate, each stroke imbued with both longing and a foreboding sense of inevitability. I couldn't help but wonder if these remnants of the past held a connection to the ghostly visitations, and if they could, in some quiet, unspoken way, be the source of the persistent unease. Every new detail, every corroborating piece of evidence, drew me deeper into the labyrinth of unanswered questions. The precinct became a second home, a sanctuary filled with late-night sessions of research and discussions with colleagues who, despite their skepticism, could not deny the growing sense of something amiss. In hushed voices over stale coffee, and in the scattered notes pinned on a community bulletin board in the evidence room, we began to discuss the possibility that these phenomena were not aberrations isolated in time and space, but part of a pattern, a spectral cycle that might repeat wherever heartache and loss were left unchecked. The idea was both fascinating and terrifying, a notion that some forces in our world were drawn to the despair of the lonely and the grieving, manifesting in ways that not even our most rigorous protocols could capture. Late one rainy evening, as I once again pored over the cases at hand, I recorded my thoughts in the quiet solitude of my office. This is Officer Cole. I'm becoming increasingly convinced that there is a dimension of our reality that we have yet to understand, a realm where the echoes of those we've lost persist, influencing the living in ways that are as subtle as they are profound. The cases I've been involved with in Pine Ridge and Birchwood are not isolated incidents, but fragments of a larger narrative. I still struggle to reconcile the clinical nature of my training with the visceral, inexplicable experiences I've encountered in the field. Yet, every piece of evidence, every whispered radio code, every flicker of movement in the darkness seems to confirm that when grief takes hold, it can bend reality just enough to let the past seep through. Even now, as I sit in a quiet room, illuminated only by the soft glow of a computer screen and the steady hum of a desk fan, those words echo in my mind, a perpetual reminder that some mysteries are too vast, too deeply interwoven with our human experience, to ever be fully understood. The investigations continue, each new case a thread in the tapestry of a story that spans not just geography and time, but the very limits of what we can know. And as I file away another report, I can't help but wonder whether the darkness that visited Maple Street, that haunted Birchwood Avenue, will one day find its way into our everyday reality again, challenging the very foundations of our certainty, and leaving us with the lingering, disquieting question: what if the line between the living and the dead is not as impenetrable as we once believed? I was wrapping up my third patrol of the night when the call came in, clear and unambiguous over dispatch at 10:27 p.m. on a chilly Tuesday in early November. I remember the crackle in the radio as my partner, Officer Daniels, advised, 10-4, Enfield Precinct, ETA 2 minutes. I parked my cruiser on the quiet suburban street off Maplewood Avenue in Cedar Ridge, a modest town where every house boasted neat lawns and trimmed hedges. The address was 1423 Willow Lane, an unassuming home that, on any other night, would have blended into the peaceful tapestry of the neighborhood. But tonight, its tranquility was shattered by an unnerving 911 call, a report from a middle-aged man named Jason Miller. The call log had already been detailed. Jason had reported strange, deliberate footsteps echoing from his attic, accompanied by unexplained whispers that sent shivers down his spine. I pulled on my light jacket and radioed in a quick 10-7 to let dispatch know I was en route. The air was thin, and the mist clung to the pavement as I hurried toward the entrance. I still recall the piercing sound of my own heartbeat as I approached the porch, where Jason, jittery yet composed, greeted me with a nod and a forced smile that didn't quite mask his inner tension. "Officer, thank you for coming," he said in a voice strained with apprehension. His casual, everyday attire stood in stark contrast to the palpable fear etched on his face. Inside, the house exuded an eerie calmness. The decor was classic Midwestern suburban, warm but ordinary. As we moved through the dim hallway, the bland hum of an old refrigerator and the distant tick of a clock filled the silence, intensifying the tension with each step. "Ma'am, I'm just going to check the attic," I explained gently as Jason trailed behind, his eyes darting nervously. I couldn't help but notice how even the soft hum of his electric heater seemed off-key this evening. I pressed the call button on the narrow panel beside the stairs, announcing over my radio, "Dispatch, I'm in the residence and heading to the attic." "Copy?" The static returned a measured 10-4, officer, and I slowly opened the pull-down ladder. Climbing up, my flashlight beam danced over exposed beams and piles of stored boxes long forgotten. The attic was vast, yet disconcertingly still. Layers of dust stirred by my footfalls hinted at a space left undisturbed for years, except for one anomaly. Etched faintly on the dust-covered floor were footprints, irregular and deliberate, leading toward a cluttered corner obscured by old cardboard boxes and antique furniture. Near these prints was a makeshift altar. A ring of half-melted candles encircled an overturned wooden crate. On it lay a bundle of weathered animal bones, a rusted key, and, most disturbing of all, a faded photograph of Jason, crudely defaced by deep, violent scratches. 10-4, dispatch. I'm seeing something here that's not just a case of a prowler. Over, I murmured over the radio, my voice barely steady. Each word was weighted with the unnerving realization that this wasn't a mere prank, but an ominous message deliberately left for Jason. I remember pausing there, breath catching in my throat as the oppressive silence of the attic pressed in. The only sounds were the soft hum of my radio and the occasional creak of the aged floorboards. I radioed down to Jason, asking, "Mr. Miller, have you ever been up in this particular part of your attic before? What's with the picture?" His voice, muffled by distance and tremor, replied, I've never seen that room before. Please, get out of there." I assured him I'd secured the scene and come back to discuss it further. But even as I descended back into the main part of the house, an unsettling certainty gnawed at me. This was more than a case of disturbed property. Back at the front door, Jason's eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his doorbell. I noted every minute detail. The precise time on his digital clock read 10:45 p.m., the chill in the air matching the frost forming on the window panes, and the palpable dread that clung to him like a second skin. It's probably just someone playing a sick joke, I tried to reassure him, though my own instincts questioned that explanation. I finished up by instructing him to call us immediately if he heard anything further, no matter how trivial it might seem. I made a mental note to file a detailed report. The exact address, the weather conditions, the precise radio call codes exchanged. Every nuance was essential for what was unfolding. With a final 10-4 over the radio, I left the scene, my thoughts heavy with the weight of the unexplained. Later that night, as I sat in the station compiling initial notes, the memory of that attic and the defaced photograph burned in my mind. I replayed the radio chatter, the clipped 10-7 and 10-4 exchanged with dispatch, the whispered uncertainty in Jason's voice, and wondered if the night had concealed a far deeper secret. The dispatch log, stamped with precise times and codes, confirmed that nothing had been tampered with except for the eerie evidence left upstairs. In a whispered aside to myself, I noted, "This isn't just about trespassing or a lonely mind playing tricks. There's something else here, a deliberate message in the guise of an urban legend come to life." I filed the report under unusual disturbances, aware that, deep down, I knew we were merely scratching the surface of a far darker mystery. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I reviewed the details meticulously. A few minutes later, my partner Daniels called out from across the room. "Hey, you got a minute? There's another call coming in from the same area." My stomach churned as I listened to the urgent dispatch. "Officer, repeat. Another call from 1423 Willow Lane. Caller says the sounds, they're back, and now there's something else. A voice, almost like a whispered code. 10 to 50 pending." My pulse quickened. This wasn't a routine check, it was escalating into something far more sinister. A scenario that, even in all my years on the force, I'd rarely encountered. I grabbed my notepad and headed back out into the cold night, the sound of my boots crunching on the frost-covered pavement echoing the rhythm of an impending storm. The crisp air carried a foreboding chill that night, as though the very elements were conspiring to bring the truth to light. My mind raced as I reviewed every detail of that earlier encounter, the strange placement of the items in the attic, the defaced photo, the inexplicable footprints, and the nagging voice in my head told me that there was more to come. I could almost hear the distant murmur of someone reciting 10 to 50, 10 to 7 over and over again, like an incantation meant to trap souls. As I drove back to Willow Lane, every red light and stop sign seemed to echo the beat of my apprehensive heart. I pulled up outside the house once more, the headlights carving harsh shadows over the familiar facade. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose window frames and adding a discordant symphony to an already tense atmosphere. I radioed in to dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Enfield Unit 17, back at the residence. Requesting immediate backup on scene, possible repeat incident. Over." The reply was immediate. "Unit 17, copy. Backup en route. Estimated time of arrival, 3 minutes. On dirt." Inside the house, everything appeared unnervingly unchanged, a silent replay of an earlier version of events. Yet, as I approached the staircase once again, my ears caught a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper of movement above. My flashlight's beam trembled as I raised it towards the attic. The ladder creaked under my weight, and I recalled Jason's pleading words from earlier. "Please, get away, there's something up there." With a deep exhale and a promise to leave no stone unturned, I ascended once more into that oppressive space. The attic was as I had left it, but the atmosphere had subtly shifted, as though the very air had thickened with despair. The half-melted candles now cast dancing, ghost-like shadows on the walls. I took a slow, measured step towards the altar, eyes scanning for any new disturbances. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible murmur that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a raccoon scuttling away or the settling of old wood. It was distinctly human. A voice, indecipherable yet urgent, whispered words that I could only catch fragments of, 10 to 50, 10 to 7. Each syllable a mournful echo in the vast emptiness. My training kicked in as I reached for my radio. "Dispatch, this is Enfield Unit 17. I'm in the attic. I'm hearing whispers, repeating codes. I'm going to secure the area. Over." The response was immediate, calm, almost rehearsed. "Unit 17, remain where you are. Backup is still en route. Stand by for further instructions." On dirt, I could feel the sweat beading on my brow despite the cold, and I knew every second stretched on impossibly. Slowly, deliberately, I circled the altar, taking photographs and making notes in real time. Every detail, the slight smear of melted wax on the crate, the arrangement of the bones, the way the photographs seemed almost deliberately slashed, spoke of a calculated act meant to terrify. That night, after I finally descended back to the worn hardwood floors of the house's living room, I sat with Jason in his cluttered kitchen, the tension between us nearly tangible. "It's not over, Jason," I whispered as I reviewed my notes with him, the low hum of his refrigerator and the occasional drip of a leaky faucet punctuating our grim conversation. "There's something here, something that's calling you, using these signals, these codes. I can't say it's paranormal, but it's nothing typical either. I'm keeping the case open, and I'll be back tomorrow for a fuller investigation." His eyes welled up with a mix of terror and resignation, and the clock on the wall ticked monotonously. Each second another reminder of a reality that was slipping away from him. Later, back at the precinct, I detailed every moment to my sergeant. The dispatch codes, the precise statements from Jason, the physical evidence, and my own chilling impressions from that attic. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran of similar calls, gave a curt nod. "Keep it tight, officer. Document everything to the letter. Sometimes the truth is hidden in the minute details," he muttered, his voice heavy with years of unspoken cases that blurred the line between fact and nightmare. I archived the initial report under case number 1147-CR and set a reminder to recheck the scene in the early morning hours. Outside, the storm clouds gathered in silent judgment, and I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. A few days later, the silence was shattered by another frantic call from Jason. It came in just past midnight, his voice cracking with desperation as he stuttered, "They're back, officer, the footsteps, and now there's something else, a whisper. I think it said my name." I could hear his labored breathing, interwoven with the soft, eerie tapping of a clock somewhere in the background. 10-4, Jason," I replied in a low, measured tone, trying to mask the rising dread in my own voice as I radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. We have a reoccurrence at 1423 Willow Lane. Requesting immediate medical and investigative backup. Over." The response was instantaneous, a flurry of static codes, and the reassurance of additional units en route. I grabbed my gear and headed out, my mind racing with possibilities that no training could fully prepare me for. I arrived to find Jason standing at his front door, his hair mussed by distress and eyes wide with terror. The scene was charged with an intensity that night. A heavy rain had started, drenching the quiet street and adding a chaotic rhythm to the ambient whispers I had heard before. "Officer, please, get inside, they're here," he pleaded, voice quavering as he fumbled with the door. I stepped in first, scanning the perimeter. The house was silent except for the sound of rain battering the roof and the intermittent crackle of the radio. "Stay here, Jason, I'm heading upstairs," I instructed firmly as I ascended the staircase once more. Back in the attic, the scene was unchanged in its bizarre arrangement, yet the oppressive atmosphere was nearly suffocating. I cautiously approached the altar again, my flashlight struggling against the dense darkness. The murmur, the same dissonant refrain of 10 to 50, 10 to 7, had returned with renewed urgency, almost as if it were chasing me. Every step, every breath, was measured and deliberate, my training on full alert. I radioed in once more. "Dispatch, I'm in the attic again. The whispering sound has intensified. I'm marking the exact location. Over." A pause, then the calm voice of dispatch answered. "Copy that, Unit 17. Backup is on scene. Remain stationary and do not disturb anything." I scanned every inch of the room, my eyes darting from the altar to a darkened corner behind a pile of old cardboard. Something moved. A fleeting shadow, perhaps. I could not be sure, but I felt the sinister presence of an observer. The oppressive silence was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps outside, and I froze as the beam of my flashlight settled on a narrow gap in the wall, as if it were a secret passage. It was in that moment that every rational explanation melted away, replaced by a raw, visceral fear. I documented every detail, the scorched smell of candle wax, the humidity clinging to the decaying wood, the almost imperceptible scratching of a window in the distance. And then I heard it clearly. A slow, deliberate knock on the attic door from within the darkness. My heart pounded as I reached for the radio. "Dispatch, I'm hearing knocking inside the attic." I repeat, there's someone knocking from the dark area. A brief pause followed, then static, and finally the familiar reply. "Unit 17, maintain your position. Do not approach further until backup arrives." On Dort, I hesitated only momentarily before retreating back down the ladder, the memory of that knock engraved in my mind. In the cool, stormy living room below, I found Jason huddled in a corner, muttering in disbelief. I told you it wasn't just in my head," he whispered with trembling conviction, the rain now masking his words in a steady, ominous cadence. That night, as I left the scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that a malignant force had been set in motion, a force that defied rational police procedure, one that would haunt both of us for months to come. Back at the station the following morning, the case file had grown disturbingly thick. I meticulously transcribed my notes, detailing every radio call, every observed shadow, every whispered code. The evidence was neatly logged under Case Number 1, 1147-CR, with timestamps noting 10:27 p.m., 10:45 p.m., and then that harrowing midnight call. My partner Daniels and I reviewed the official protocols for domestic disturbances with unknown origins, cross-referencing every minute detail with standard procedure handbooks and internal investigation guidelines. We spoke with the sergeant, who in his gruff yet concerned tone remarked, "Officer, sometimes these calls aren't just about intruders. They can be manifestations of something we can't neatly file in your usual reports." His cryptic statement chilled me to the bone. I wasn't entirely sure what he meant, but the intensity of the unfolding events left little room for simple explanations. The morning light was weak and gray as I drove back to Willow Lane for a follow-up investigation. The air was damp, and a persistent drizzle had replaced the earlier downpour, lending an eerie calm to a place that had witnessed so much despair the night before. I interviewed neighbors discreetly, collecting fragmented anecdotes that painted a disturbing picture. Whispers in the night, fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when approached, and a persistent sense that something malevolent lurked in the shadows of Cedar Ridge. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Carter from the block, recounted with a shaky voice, "I heard them, soft footsteps and a strange humming. It wasn't like any normal sound I've heard in all my years here." Her words, unadorned with exaggeration, added a layer of grim authenticity to the case. I returned to the scene, not as a lone investigator but accompanied by a small team. Detective Ramirez, a seasoned veteran known for his meticulous attention to detail, and Officer Lee, whose calm demeanor under pressure often balanced my own rising panic. We rechecked every inch of the property, focusing once more on that attic, which now seemed less like an isolated room and more like a crypt holding secrets that defied explanation. Each of us took turns recording observations, occasionally pausing as if the very walls might whisper untold stories. Detective Ramirez, scanning the room with a critical eye, murmured, "It's almost as if someone wanted to recreate a ritual. Every detail, every misplaced object is deliberate." His words hung in the air, thick and foreboding. We collected samples, lumps of dried wax from the altar, fragments of the defaced photographs sealed in evidence bags, and even swabs of dust that glowed under our portable UV lights. Every piece was catalogued with precision. As the team worked, I couldn't help but think back to that night. The frantic whispers on the radio, the eerie knock in the attic, and the torment in Jason's voice. It was as if the house itself had taken on a life of its own, an unwilling witness to a tragedy that was still unfolding. This isn't just a case of psychological pressure, it's a full-blown assault on the senses, I confided quietly to Officer Lee as we packed our equipment. The sense of dread was more than procedural. It was deeply personal, resonating within the marrow of my bones. That day, while the evidence was being sent to forensics, I sat in the interrogation room with Jason, a man whose eyes spoke volumes of sleepless nights and relentless terror. His voice, subdued and steady, recounted the incidents with a haunting clarity, the unmistakable sound of his name being whispered, the soft rhythm of footsteps that no one could account for, and the palpable presence of an unseen entity that seemed to feed on his deepest fears. "I'm not making this up," he pleaded, his hands shaking as he clutched a frayed blanket. "Every time it happens, I feel this cold, paralyzing force, like I'm being watched by something I can't fight." I pressed him gently for every detail. The exact time the whispers began, the nature of the voices, the objects he might have disturbed in his frantic attempts to flee. His answers were measured, the kind of responses one gives when the line between reality and nightmare blurs. It started innocently enough, like a creak or a gust of wind, he said slowly. But then it became something more. It was as if I was living through a reenactment of my worst fears every time I went up there. His voice broke at the final words, a sound that echoed in the sterile quiet of the room. By the end of the day, with the evidence securely in hand and the investigative team exhausted, yet determined, I filed the final report for that phase of the case. I knew that the deeper we delved into the incident at 1423 Willow Lane, the more we would unearth complexities that defied conventional logic. The case had already begun to etch itself into the annals of unsolved mysteries. A case that would eventually disturb even those hardened by years on the force. As I closed the file for the day, I couldn't help but cast one last lingering glance at the photograph of Jason's defaced visage. wondering what dark force had orchestrated this torment, and whether it would ever be laid to rest. In the ensuing days, as I tried to find solace amid stacks of paperwork and late-night case reviews, I began noticing details that threatened to blur the lines between evidence and an all-consuming nightmare. Late at night in the station's break room, while sifting through the forensic notes, I recalled a conversation with a retired detective who had once encountered a similar case. A case dismissed as mass hysteria, until unexplained accounts of spectral occurrences forced a reconsideration of what was deemed possible. His words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the truth is too terrible for the living to bear, and the spirits of those forgotten find solace in exposing that truth. Though I'd once scoffed at such ideas, the relentless horror of this case had forced even my rational mind to consider the unexplainable. That unsettled thought took root as I prepared for my next shift. I made sure to log every detail: weather, times, dispatch codes, the names of all officers, and the meticulous notes about each communication. My chronicle was becoming a tapestry of cold facts interwoven with feelings of dread. A tapestry I couldn't simply discard. I kept rereading Jason's statements, each retelling of his ordeal like a stab in my gut. Every whisper felt like a personal condemnation, he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, laden with raw emotion and despair. I couldn't shake the memory of his haunted eyes, nor could I forget the way the house itself seemed to breathe, exuding an unspoken warning of danger yet unseen. At the precise hour of 3:15 a.m., when the station's corridors were draped in silence, my pager buzzed with a new notification, a subtle, almost imperceptible sign that the case was far from over. A call had come in, not from Jason, but from an anonymous number with an ominous tone that chilled me to the bone. The message was brief, containing only coordinates and a timestamp, along with the cryptic notation, "They are coming." My hands trembled as I logged the information, every instinct screaming that this was the prelude to something catastrophic. The coordinates pointed to a derelict building on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a place abandoned long ago yet whispered about in hushed tones among locals. A building rumored to be the epicenter of a series of unsolved events spanning decades. I alerted my supervisor and dispatched a secondary team while I carefully prepared to investigate this new lead. In the quiet hum of the squad room, with rain beginning to pelt the windows once again outside, I pondered the implications of that message. Was it a hoax, or did it signal that the disturbing occurrences at Willow Lane were merely the opening act in a long, unholy procession of terror? With each passing minute, the sense of impending inevitability grew, and I found myself caught in a silent battle between duty and dread. I knew that this new development would challenge every piece of logic and every protocol I'd relied on throughout my career. Still, I steeled myself, determined to see it through, come what may. By the time the backup arrived, a medley of seasoned detectives and uniformed officers, each silent and resolute, we were all acutely aware that the boundaries between the natural and the inexplicable were about to blur. The team and I set up a perimeter around the decrepit building, its windows shattered and walls marred by graffiti and decay, the very image of forsaken urban legend. I could almost hear the rhythmic cadence of a police radio in my ears, a constant reminder of the codes and structure that, until now, had defined our existence. 10-4, Unit 17, I repeated softly, my voice echoing off the cold concrete walls as I glanced back at the station clock. The stark reality of the moment was sinking in. We were on the verge of investigating something that defied every norm of our training, something that might well unravel our understanding of both order and chaos. I took one last look at the well-worn file in my hands, the pages thick with reports, sketches, photographs, and the ever-present transcript of whispered 911 calls that had first drawn me into this labyrinth of terror. Every detail had been logged meticulously, every code and timestamp noted in the margins with surgical precision. I couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere in the tangled web of radio chatter, there lay a hidden message, a secret intended for only the initiated, a warning from beyond our ken. As we moved toward the building, our flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness, I braced myself for whatever awaited us inside. The line between rational police work and an unspeakable nightmare was perilously thin, and I knew in my core that by the end of this night nothing would ever be the same. Even now, as I recall that night in the precinct, the hushed whispers in the corridors, the constant, unyielding pressure of unanswered questions, I remain unsettled. The case of 1423 Willow Lane, punctuated by coded cries and haunted silences, was no longer just another entry in my logbook. It had become a part of me, an indelible mark on my soul, a reminder that sometimes the truth is stranger, and far more terrifying than any fiction we dare to imagine. I've seen plenty in my time on the force, but nothing compares to the relentless dread that clings to you when the evidence seems to whisper of forces beyond our control. The investigation continued, each day unveiling more questions than answers, until one final call brought everything full circle. A call that would force me to confront the unthinkable, and forever change the way I understood the thin veil separating our reality from something far darker. The voice on the other end was barely a whisper, laced with despair and resignation. "They've taken her, officer. They said it's all over," it rasped, almost as if the words were coming from someone long dead. I raced to the hospital where Jason had been admitted days earlier, only to find him in a state far worse than I'd feared. His once steady heartbeat was now erratic, his body emaciated under the harsh fluorescent lights of a sterile emergency room. As I sat by his bedside, the doctors conferring in low tones about his deteriorating condition, I couldn't help but see the evidence of something far more malignant than any physical ailment. His eyes, once clear and alert, now reflected a terror that spoke of encounters with an unknown entity, a force that had stripped him not only of his health but also of his will to fight. In the hospital corridor, I exchanged terse words with the attending physician. "No physical cause can explain this decline," he confided, shaking his head. "He's in shock, maybe even something neurological we can't pinpoint." I listened, frustrated by the inability of modern medicine to address the intangible terror that had taken root in Jason's life. The whispers on the radio, the knock in the attic, every piece of evidence pointed to a sinister design, a design that was as methodical as it was malevolent. Amid the sterile beeps of monitors and the murmur of well-meaning colleagues, I wrestled with a gnawing question. Was this the work of a disturbed mind, or was something else, something otherworldly, at play? That lingering question was only partially answered that fateful night when a forensic analyst came into the room with a single, chilling observation. "Officer," he said quietly, handing over a freshly printed report, "we found traces of an unusual substance on the defaced photograph and near the altar. It's not something we typically see, a compound that reacts as if it's absorbing electromagnetic energy, almost like it's alive." His eyes met mine, and in that moment, the sterile clinical setting melted away, replaced by the cold, unforgiving reality of forces beyond our comprehension. The substance, the whispering codes, Jason's inexplicable decline, it all formed a mosaic of terror that defied the bounds of everyday policing. Even as I filed this account with painstaking detail, every timestamp, every coded radio exchange, every trembling plea from Jason, my mind remains haunted by that final discovery. The subsequent investigation yielded no concrete leads, and the trail eventually went cold, leaving behind only cryptic photographs, unsettling samples, and the perpetual echo of those ghostly codes. In the aftermath, as I sat in my patrol car reflecting on the unsolvable mysteries of that case, the thought that perhaps we had poked at something that should have been left alone gnawed at me relentlessly. There remains a lingering question in the quiet moments before dawn. Was it simply the workings of a disturbed individual in a quiet town, or had we unwittingly become entangled in a far more sinister conspiracy, one that blurred the lines between the living and the dead, the known and the unknowable? The night had a weight about it that I couldn't shake, a heavy, almost suffocating blanket of darkness over Maple Grove Estates in rural Ohio. I'd been working the graveyard shift for over 17 years, but nothing had ever prepared me for a call like this. It was 2:43 a.m. on a bitterly cold autumn evening when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Unit 12. We have a 911 call coming in from 2433 Birchwood Lane. Possible disturbance. Over. I could hear the tension in his tone, a subtle quiver that hinted at dread. I replied with measured calm, Unit 12 copies. En route. Over. As I slammed the cruiser into gear, the steady patter of rain on the windshield melded with the hum of the engine. The chill in the air wasn't just from the weather. It was the inexplicable hint of something amiss, something that had the power to curdle the marrow in your bones. The drive to Birchwood Lane was long and monotonous, punctuated only by the low rumble of the radio's static and the occasional distant siren from another unit. I was alone in the vehicle for most of the trip, save for the silent reassurance of the familiar dashboard lights and the comforting routine of our dispatch codes. 10-4, acknowledging orders, 10-7 for off-duty, and the quick clip of 10-50 whenever an anomaly was reported. As I navigated the narrow, tree-lined streets of Maple Grove, I recalled the countless nights spent patrolling these sleepy suburbs, a tapestry of identical houses and manicured lawns that hid more secrets than they let on. The ambient glow of streetlights barely illuminated the slick pavement as the rain intensified, splattering relentlessly against the windshield as if trying to wash away the sins of the night. Pulling up in front of a modest two-story colonial home on Birchwood Lane, I noted immediately that something was off. The house, usually a picture of suburban calm, exuded an eerie silence and dishevelment. The front door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the gusting wind, and a solitary porch light flickered like a distressed heartbeat. I parked the cruiser a safe distance away and radioed in. Dispatch, this is Unit 12 at Birchwood Lane. I've arrived on scene. Situation appears unsettled. Requesting immediate backup. Over. The crackle of the response, a terse 10-4, Unit 12, backup en route. Over, did little to calm the knot in my stomach. I stepped out into the cold, the sound of my own boots crunching on the gravel echoing in the near silence of the night. With a flashlight in hand and my service belt clinking softly, I approached the house. Each step measured, every nerve on high alert. Inside, the living room told its own story of chaos. The furniture was knocked askew, with a scattering of personal items that seemed hastily abandoned. The low, persistent hum of the old refrigerator underscored the oppressive quiet, and every shadow in the room suggested an unseen presence. I moved carefully, calling out in my best calm tone, "This is Officer Reynolds with the Maple Grove Police. Is anyone in there?" My voice bounced off the walls and faded into the cavernous emptiness. No response came, only the eerie creak of aged floorboards under my weight. I scanned the room with my flashlight, a thin beam slicing through the darkness, when something caught my eye. In the far corner, barely visible, a dark shape shifted and then vanished. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly moved toward the spot. As I reached the corner, I could only see a trick of the light and an oddly shaped shadow along the wall. My hand trembled imperceptibly on my flashlight, and I urged myself to remain professional despite the creeping sense of foreboding. The sound of hurried footsteps from the back of the house made me spin around, and I signaled for Officer Daniels, my partner, a seasoned veteran whose calm demeanor had often steadied my own rattled nerves, to join me. "Daniels, you there? I'm in the living room. I think something's off," I whispered through the comm. His measured 10-4, "I'm on my way," came after a tense pause. Together we moved toward the back door. With each step, every creak and rustle became a portent of impending chaos. I recalled previous calls, smaller disturbances that had turned out to be nothing more than a prank or a momentary lapse in routine. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the oppressive weight of dread in the air was palpable, as if the darkness itself were watching, waiting. Outside, the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the asphalt was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, frenzied tapping. A persistent sound coming from the overgrown backyard. The address marker, 2433 Birchwood Lane, shuddered in the wind as we approached a side window. I peered through the grimy glass and saw nothing but the dark void of the unkempt yard. With no clear answers, I retraced our steps back into the foyer, noting every detail. The burst of cold air as a window remained open, the faint trace of footprints on the wet floor leading to a closed door. I whispered, "Daniels, check the basement. I have a bad feeling about this." In response, his steady voice crackled, "Copy that, Reynolds. I'm heading down now." The descent into the basement was a slow, deliberate act, each creak of the stairs echoing like a countdown to the inevitable. Even as I watched Daniels disappear into the murk, my mind churned with questions. What could have caused the residents to make that frantic 911 call? And more importantly, what was it that I sensed? A trick of the light, a figment of my imagination warped by exhaustion, or something far more sinister lurking beneath the veneer of everyday suburban life? The tension built with every step I took back to the living room, where I radioed dispatch updates and maintained a continuous loop on the comms. Unit 12 to dispatch, all clear in the foyer, but I'm maintaining observation. Backup en route. The response was a terse affirmation, and my eyes never left the darkened corners of the house. Inside, the unsettled silence was punctuated by occasional, inexplicable sounds. A creak here, a whisper of movement there. My flashlight beam juggled with the shadows, as if in a macabre dance with the darkness itself. I began to question the reliability of my own senses when a soft, indistinct murmur reached my ears, a sound that might have been a hushed conversation or the distant rustling of fabric. I strained to discern words, but they were swallowed by the thick, humid air of fear. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred, and for one agonizing moment, I wondered if the call had been a prelude to something unimaginable. Daniel's voice suddenly reverberated through the comm from the basement, low and urgent. "Reynolds, you need to come down now. I've seen something. It's not right." My blood ran cold. I sprinted down the creaking stairs, the flashlight beam shaking violently in my grasp as I reached the bottom. The basement was a cavernous space cluttered with old storage boxes, forgotten furniture, and the heavy odor of damp decay. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb overhead that cast jittery shadows along the walls. In one corner, stacked against a brick wall, lay a scatter of papers and an old jacket, the remnants of a life abruptly interrupted. The narrow beam of my light fell upon a dark figure near the far wall, a subtle yet distinctly human silhouette, crouched as if hiding or cowering from something unseen. Daniel stood beside me, his face etched in fear and disbelief. "Reynolds, that's not one of them," he whispered, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts. "I've never seen anyone like that in these parts." I swallowed hard, feeling the cold tendrils of dread coil tighter around my spine. "Dispatch, we have a contact in the basement. I repeat, we've located an unidentified subject, requesting immediate lockdown and investigation support." There was a long silence before the dispatcher replied with barely contained concern. "Unit 12, maintain visual. Backup is on its way. Over." And so we stood there, two figures bathed in the sickly glow of a dying light, hearts pounding in rhythm with our escalating terror as we braced ourselves for what lay beyond the next dark corner. The investigation took on an even more disorienting quality as we began a meticulous search of the basement. Every shadow seemed to move with a mind of its own. Every creak whispered secrets of a past that was best left undisturbed. I retraced steps and cross-checked every corridor of the old structure, all the while narrating the scene into my personal recorder. A habit formed from years of wanting to document every shred of evidence, every fleeting moment of fear. "It's like the very walls are alive," I murmured into the recorder, my voice echoing in the cavern of emptiness. Daniels, meanwhile, methodically checked every storage closet and behind every collapsed pallet of old newspapers. The absence of any obvious signs of foul play was at once perplexing and maddening. We were caught in a limbo where every fact seemed to contradict the mounting sense of horror. A place where logic and fear waged a silent war within our minds. In the midst of our examination, something inexplicable happened. As I squared off against a large, dust-covered filing cabinet, a cold gust of wind, unwelcome and unaccounted for, slammed the door of the basement shut with a resonant bang. The sound ricocheted off the concrete walls, and for a moment time itself seemed to freeze. Daniels's face went ashen as he gripped his flashlight tighter. "Reynolds, did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. I nodded, though words failed me. In the oppressive darkness, my mind raced through every possibility. A structural flaw, an open window, even an errant animal. But nothing explained the chill that now engulfed the entire space. The hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead became a droning heartbeat that pounded in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was biding its time in the shadows. I moved toward the closed door and, with trembling hands, tried to pry it open. The door, solid and unyielding, creaked slightly as I forced it, revealing nothing beyond but a corridor that stretched back into darkness. In that moment, the basement no longer felt like a part of an ordinary house, but rather a threshold to another realm. A realm where the rules of reality bent and twisted in the shape of your deepest fears. I radioed dispatch again. "Unit 12 to dispatch. We're experiencing anomalous conditions in the basement. Request further instructions. Over." The reply, laced with an undertone of apprehension, was measured yet terse. "Unit 12, stand by. Do not disturb the scene further. Backup is en route. Over." The finality in that response did little to ease my mind. Standing there, in the heart of a home that suddenly felt like it had been warped by something otherworldly, I wondered how a seemingly routine call could unravel into a nightmare that we were only beginning to understand. As the minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity, every passing second amplified the sense of isolation, vulnerability, and despair. We eventually secured the perimeter of the basement, meticulously retracing every step as the faint sound of approaching sirens signaled that additional units were arriving. I kept my recorder running, documenting every murmur of the building's discontent, every anxious whisper that escaped our lips. I never imagined my 17 years on the force would lead me to a scene like this, I said in a low, trembling tone into the device, my voice punctuating the oppressive silence. That night, the boundaries between rational police procedure and something far more sinister blurred in a way that left us rattled to the core. And as I sat back in the warmth of the cruiser with my hands still shaking from adrenaline, I couldn't help but question the nature of the unknown that had trespassed into our mundane world. A mystery that would haunt me long after the call was logged as just another anomaly in the endless routine of duty. Even after we closed the scene and filed our initial reports, with all the necessary police jargon, code references, and exhaustive details that any officer would dutifully document, the uneasy disquiet gnawed at me. Over the following days, I combed through the surveillance footage from nearby street cameras, hoping to rationalize the inexplicable events with solid evidence. In one grainy clip time-stamped 2:57 a.m., I caught a glimpse of the spectral silhouette in the backyard, barely discernible, but unmistakably there. I reviewed the recordings with a fine-tooth comb, noting every detail. The sound of hurried footsteps, the hush of frightened whispers over the radio, and a series of moments where reality itself seemed to warp with a palpable, almost malevolent presence. I called Daniels into my office at the station, and we painstakingly cross-examined every frame, every pixel. "It's like it's there one moment and gone the next," Daniels confessed, his voice heavy with disbelief. "But that chill, that feeling of being watched, I swear I've never experienced anything like it." His words resonated with me, echoing in the back of my mind as I reviewed the file with meticulous care. In the subsequent days, interviews with neighbors and witnesses only deepened the mystery. An elderly man from across the street from Birchwood Lane recounted how, on that stormy night, he'd heard frantic 911 calls and seen a fleeting shadow outside his kitchen window. A young woman, her voice trembling over the phone as she described hearing muted cries and desperate whispers, reinforced the account. Every piece of testimony painted a picture of a night that defied explanation. A night where a palpable terror had taken hold of an otherwise peaceful community. My superiors at the station advised caution and insisted that the incident be logged as a possible psychological manifestation induced by stress and environmental factors. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough to explain the phenomenon. The events were too precise, too coordinated, and too disturbing to be chalked up merely to overactive imaginations or glitches in recording devices. As the investigation wore on, I spent restless nights replaying every detail. I'd sit in my small apartment, the only light a dim desk lamp, and review the recordings again and again. The radio chatter from that fateful night, the exact timbre of the dispatcher's voice, and the frantic, almost desperate tone in Daniel's calls, the minutiae of it all weighed heavily on my sanity. I found myself lost in thought, meticulously reconstructing the timeline in my head. It wasn't merely an isolated incident, I began to suspect. The very fabric of that night had threads that tied into other unexplained events that had cropped up in the region over the past few months. A string of 911 calls from nearby suburbs where similar anomalies were reported. In one case, a small-town sheriff in a neighboring county had described a mysterious figure lurking near abandoned warehouses, always watching but never interfering. In another, residents from a quiet cul-de-sac reported eerie occurrences of objects moving on their own in the dead of night. The patterns, though subtle, were there, and they conspired to create a tapestry of dread that defied conventional explanation. That night at the station, As I reviewed the night's incidents on an aging CRT monitor, the images merged into an indistinct swirl of fear and uncertainty. The cold, precise language of our reports did little to capture the raw terror of being face to face with the unknown. Every detail was archived in the official file: the timestamps, the police codes, the meticulous descriptions of a scene gone wrong. Yet, all that lay beneath the clinical documentation was a lingering sense of despair. I recorded my final thoughts in the official log, stating in formal language what no officer ever wishes to admit aloud. The events of 2433 Birchwood Lane challenge our understanding of reality and defy standard explanation. Further investigation is warranted. And as I signed off the report for the night, a chill crawled up my spine, reminding me that some mysteries are perhaps better left unexplored, no matter how much the call for answers might echo in the stillness of the night. Over the next week, while the official inquiry progressed at a measured pace typical of small-town bureaucracy, I found myself unable to escape the memories. Every time I glanced at my station clock during the long, dreary shifts, it was as if time itself was mocking me, each second a reminder of that unexplainable night. I began receiving cryptic messages on the police radio, unintelligible murmurs that some of the newer recruits dismissed as interference, but which resonated ominously with those of us who had witnessed that night firsthand. One chilly evening, as I was finalizing a routine report, a call came in that sent a shiver straight through my core. Unit 12, 1050 at Cedar Run Apartments, 3:12 a.m. possible disturbance. I hesitated only for a moment before replying. 10-4, en route. This wasn't the first time such calls had been made, and each one carried with it that same eerie undercurrent, a sense of inevitability, as though something was orchestrating these events with deliberate malice. I knew, deep down, that the shadow we encountered at Birchwood was just the beginning, a harbinger of an unsettling pattern that spanned multiple neighborhoods, binding disparate accounts into one horrifying enigma. Even as the official investigation leaned toward rational explanations, a combination of mass hysteria, environmental illusions, and the psychological toll of long, unyielding shifts, I couldn't shake off the conviction that we were dealing with something beyond the scope of traditional policing. I engaged in long, often sleepless conversations with colleagues who had seen their share of bizarre incidents, only to realize that many of them harbored similar, unspoken doubts. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, and every police report was now tinged with an undercurrent of the inexplicable. As I sat in the quiet of my office, the glow of the monitor reflecting off my tired eyes, I couldn't help but wonder if we were all being pulled toward a dark center, a vortex of fear and uncertainty from which there would be no easy escape. The city, with its neatly trimmed hedges and orderly streets, now felt like a stage set for an unfolding tragedy. Each whisper on the wind carried the echoes of that night, and every sudden gust seemed to stir up memories best left buried. I started to document not only the events but also the emotional toll they took on all of us. The palpable anxiety in the dispatch room, the hollow eyes of officers who had faced what they couldn't explain, and the whispered warnings among neighbors who lived in perpetual apprehension. My recorder captured every confession, every trembling admission of fear. "I still wake up in the middle of the night," Daniels admitted in one recorded conversation. "I hear those footsteps, feel that cold dread creeping in, like something out there is waiting for us to forget what happened." His words, raw and unfiltered, resonated with the collective unease that had settled over our community. And as I listened to the static-laden recordings in the dead hours of dawn, I found myself questioning not just what we had seen, but the very nature of the forces that haunted our streets, a force that seemed to be growing bolder by the day. One evening, as dusk gave way to the oppressive dark of night, I received another call. A 911 call that sent my pulse racing anew. This time, it wasn't from Birchwood Lane or Cedar Run Apartments, but from a quiet cul-de-sac in the neighboring town of Silver Creek. The caller's voice was strained, laced with panic. "Please, someone help us. There's something out there. Outside." I rushed to the scene, the urgency in the caller's tone propelling me through rain-drenched streets and dimly lit avenues. Arriving at a modest home on Maple Street, I found a scene eerily reminiscent of that first encounter. A door left ajar, interior lights flickering, and a silence so profound it almost screamed. As I stepped over the threshold, the overwhelming sense of dread returned in full force. It was as though the very air was saturated with the memory of that fateful night, drawing me inexorably deeper into the labyrinth of fear and uncertainty that now plagued our community. And in that moment, standing amid the detritus of a life turned upside down, I couldn't help but wonder if I, too, was becoming part of a narrative that was far larger and far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The storm raged on outside as I methodically began another round of inspections, questioning the few neighbors who had gathered in hushed clusters on the sidewalks, their eyes darting nervously toward the darkness beyond. Every whispered account, every trembling voice painted the same picture. A presence, a dark, inhuman shape, drifting along the edge of their reality, leaving despair and a deep-seated terror in its wake. One man, his voice trembling as he recounted the events, spoke of an overwhelming feeling of imminent doom as he peered out his window. Another woman recounted how her young son cried out in terror for a shadow that lingered near his crib. I recorded these accounts with the detached professionalism of a seasoned officer, yet with every word I transcribed, the horror of it all compounded. Was it possible that these seemingly isolated incidents were part of a larger, interconnected web? A malevolent force that was now choosing its next victims with deliberate intent? Even as the line between police procedure and the inexplicable blurred before my eyes, one thing was undeniable. Something was stalking the quiet streets of our once peaceful community, and it was far more sinister than anyone had ever dared to imagine. As the weeks turned into a surreal montage of sleepless nights and anxious patrols, I found myself haunted not only by the memories of that initial night at Birchwood, but also by the slow, creeping dread that invaded every quiet corner of Maple Grove. The daily routine of our shifts now took on a macabre rhythm. A series of coded alerts, whispered warnings over the radio, and the constant nagging feeling that the darkness was closing in. Every time the dispatch crackled with a new call, 10:50 at, or possible disturbance at, my heart would race with the same trepidation I had felt that first night. The official memos and reports were filed, the board meetings held with clinical detachment, yet no one could shake the pervasive sense that something deeply unsettling was festering right under our noses. And so, I continued my work, recording every detail, every unexplained anomaly into my log. A desperate attempt to make sense of an ever-growing nightmare. There were moments, in the still hours of the early morning, when I would catch a glimpse of something in the reflection of a shop window or the darkened glass of a parked car. A movement that wasn't quite right. A shadow that lingered a beat too long. It was during one such night that I found myself driving along an isolated stretch of road near Silver Creek when the radio suddenly burst into static. Amid the hissing noise, a faint voice, trembling and indistinct, whispered, "It's coming back! It's coming back!" I pulled over, heart pounding, and listened as the message repeated itself. clearer this time, as if the very darkness were trying to communicate its intent. I couldn't help but shudder. Was it a taunt from a disturbed mind, or a deliberate harbinger from that insidious presence we had encountered? The unanswered question gnawed at me, fueling my determination to dig deeper into an investigation that now felt impossibly vast, stretching across multiple towns, and shattering the veneer of normalcy that had long defined our lives. Even now, as I write these words, a confession recorded in the solitude of my battered station office, I am haunted by that lingering question. What truly lurks in the depths of our quiet streets? The calls, the unexplained movements captured on grainy video, the visceral terror on the faces of those who dared to speak of their encounters, all serve as a stark reminder that the world we think we know may hide horrors we're ill-equipped to comprehend. And in the dead of night, when the familiar hum of the radio falls silent, and the only sound is the relentless drumming of rain against the pavement, I can still hear that desperate whisper in the static, urging me to confront a truth so unthinkable that it shakes the very foundation of everything I believed about my duty as a protector. I picked up the dispatch call at precisely 22:47 on a rainy November evening in Westwood, a modest town with more stories than its population could ever tell. I'm Officer Mark Daniels, and I've been on the night shift for over 15 years, but nothing had prepared me for that call. The radio crackled with static before the clear voice of dispatch broke through. Unit 14, we have a 911 call from 1532 Oak Ridge Avenue. Disturbing noises reported. Possible trespasser. Respond immediately. Over. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I acknowledged. 10-4, dispatch. En route. The sound of rain tapping on my windshield punctuated the urgency of my thoughts. I knew 911 calls were never straightforward. They carried weight, and often something dark lurked beneath the surface of routine disturbances. The drive to Oak Ridge was a blur of slick, rain-soaked streets and neon reflections from closed storefronts. I parked a few blocks away from the address, a modest, two-story house that looked out of place amid neatly trimmed lawns and traditional American suburban architecture. As I walked towards the scene, my radio murmured updates from nearby units, repeating routine codes and check-ins in clipped professional tones. Unit 17, copy 10-7. Suspect unidentified, maintain safety. Every word reinforced the solemn ritual of our duties, a stark reminder that even in small towns, emergencies could spiral into inexplicable horrors. Reaching the property, I noted that the front porch light was off, a rarity in these parts where neighbors always left a window lit at night. I fumbled for my flashlight and radioed, "Dispatch, this is Daniels. I'm at Oak Ridge Avenue. There's no sign of forced entry. However, I hear faint voices from inside the house. Requesting backup. Over." The door creaked ominously when I pushed it open, and the stale smell of damp wood and decay greeted me. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating a living room frozen in time. Scattered newspapers, a toppled chair, and a broken picture frame hinting at happier moments long past. Somewhere in the background, the relentless patter of the rain mingled with soft, desperate whispers that sent shivers down my spine. Every step further inside felt like venturing into an unseen realm. The subtle echo of my boots on creaking floorboards was the only sound until, from an upstairs hallway, I picked up the unmistakable murmur of a terrified person. It's happening again." A trembling voice whispered over the intercom of my mind, urging me to tread carefully. I spoke softly. "This is Officer Daniels. I'm here to help, but I need you to remain calm and stay where you are." The response was muffled, almost as if the speaker were hiding behind layers of dread and disbelief. I moved upstairs, each step measured and deliberate, the atmosphere growing heavier with every footfall. The hallway was lined with family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my progress, reflecting the anguish and secrets of a life that had once been full of promise. In the farthest room, I found the source of the sound, a small study that looked hastily abandoned. Papers were strewn across the desk. A cold cup of coffee sat half-finished beside a glowing computer monitor, and in the corner, an elderly woman huddled in a darkened chair. Her eyes were wide with fear, and as soon as our eyes met, she began to babble in a voice that quavered like a fragile melody. They're in the walls. They're watching. Her words pierced the silence like a warning bell, and I instinctively reached out, lowering my voice to a calming cadence. "Ma'am, you're safe now. I'm going to get you help. Stay with me." The tension in the room was palpable, every shadow a potential threat as the woman's hysteria painted a picture of imminent danger. I radioed for immediate medical and specialized support. Unit 14 to dispatch. I've secured a 911 call at Oak Ridge. Need paramedics and tactical backup. I repeat, need immediate assistance at Oak Ridge Avenue. Over. The line crackled in response, the familiar codes a temporary reassurance amidst the encroaching chaos. As I escorted the woman downstairs to safety, the house itself seemed to groan under its own history. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls as if trying to escape the burden of hidden secrets, and every creak and whisper of wind through the broken windows added to the mounting suspense. Outside, thunder rumbled low and threatening in the distance, synchronized with the pounding of my heart. While waiting for backup, I kept a vigilant watch on the surroundings, every instinct screaming that something wasn't right. I found a discarded notebook on a side table, its pages filled with frantic scribbles and references to old local legends, stories of restless spirits and tragedies that had plagued the town long before modern amenities and technology. The notebook mentioned the name Evelyn repeatedly, a common name in Westwood, but here it was transformed into a haunting refrain that suggested the house's history was intertwined with loss and sorrow. I couldn't shake the feeling that the call wasn't merely about an intruder. It was a cry from the past, a disturbance that blurred the line between reality and the remnants of old wounds. After securing the woman in a neighbor's home where warmth and proper care replaced the menace of the forsaken house, I returned to the scene with a heavy mind. While backup arrived, tactical units, paramedics, and seasoned detectives, I began a meticulous review of every detail. I talked to nearby residents, many of whom recalled strange happenings over the years. Phantom voices at night, lights flickering in otherwise dark homes, and eerie figures seen in the peripheral gloom of their driveways. Each account, delivered in hushed tones and trembling words, added layers to an already disturbing mosaic. "I saw her," one man insisted as he recalled an apparition near the old Miller place, just standing there, looking right at me, even though I was alone. These testimonies, though diverse in detail, all hinted at an underlying force that was both unexplainable and profoundly personal. Inside the investigation, routine procedures took on an ethereal quality. I reviewed the phone records, scrutinized surveillance footage, and combed through witness statements, all while the storm outside mirrored the turbulence of the situation. The rain had eased slightly, but a cold mist now crept along the ground, transforming the neighborhood into a stage of spectral apparitions. Through my radio, other officers reported similar eerie encounters across Westwood, a pattern emerging that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, but a ripple in a broader, uncharted anomaly. By the time I wrapped up my initial report, my voice was steadied by professionalism, but my soul trembled with unspoken dread. The call of 911, a siren in the night, had unfurled layers of mystery that defied easy explanation. I spent the remainder of the night at the station, my mind replaying every detail while I methodically logged events into my report. The final piece of evidence was a series of recorded radio transmissions from that fateful evening. Amid the standard codes and updates, a single garbled message shivered through the static, barely discernible and laden with terror. "They're inside, the walls. Don't let 'em in." I replayed the message repeatedly, trying to catch every nuance. My colleagues exchanged uneasy glances as one veteran officer muttered, "That's the kind of thing you hear in the movies, not on a real call." But even as skepticism clashed with our shared instincts, we all knew the gravity of that fractured voice. As dawn crept over Westwood, tinted with a bleak gray that promised more uncertainty than hope, I couldn't help but wonder if I had unwittingly unearthed a truth that many in our community had tried to bury, one that would forever haunt the corridors of our memories, long after the echoes of that night had faded. The next evening, barely 24 hours after the Oak Ridge incident, my cruiser was pulled over a narrow road leading to the outskirts of Westwood. This time, the call came in over the radio with an urgency that rivaled the previous night's events. Unit 14, 10-33 at 47 Blackwood Lane. Disturbance reported. Suspect actively roaming the premises, may be armed. My stomach churned as I scanned the address on my dashboard. Blackwood Lane was in an area notorious for its abandoned farmhouses and overgrown fields, a place that local legends had long claimed was cursed by misfortune. With no time to hesitate, I responded, 10-4, en route. The drive was relentless. Rain had returned in a torrential downpour, and the familiar neon haze of Westwood's rundown diners and liquor stores blurred past me as I navigated slick, winding country roads. Upon arrival, my senses were assaulted by the overwhelming aura of decay and isolation. The building at 47 Blackwood Lane was a decrepit farmhouse that had seen better days, its once proud architecture now a crumbling testament to forgotten decades. I parked under the meager cover of a gnarled oak tree, its limbs twisting like arthritic fingers against the stormy sky. Before stepping out, I ensured that my radio was set to continuous monitoring. "Dispatch, this is Daniels. Arrived at Blackwood Lane, proceeding with caution, over." I advanced toward the entrance, the heavy wood door creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling. The only illumination came from sporadic flashes of lightning that revealed peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and deep-set stains on the floor. Marks of a violent past that the building itself refused to forget. A persistent patter of rain and the occasional rumble of thunder were the only sounds as I methodically made my way through each room. The layout was disjointed, with narrow hallways leading to storage spaces cluttered with relics of farm life. Old tools, rusted machinery, and faded photographs whose subjects seemed to warn of buried secrets. I radioed for backup again. "Dispatch, I'm in the structure." "Unknown." "Suspect in sight, I repeat. Unknown suspect on site." Over the radio came the familiar cadence of confirmation. "Unit 14, copy. Backup is en route. Maintain situational awareness." En direct. In one of the parlor rooms, I finally encountered the source of disturbance. A man, or rather what remained of him, huddled in a corner near a shattered window. His clothes were soaked through, his eyes wild with terror as he gasped, They're coming from the fields. I heard voices calling my name. I can't escape." His words tumbled out in a disjointed rush, punctuated by desperate sobs and gasps for air. I kept my tone firm yet sympathetic. "Sir, you're safe now. I'm here to help. Stay calm and tell me what you saw." His shaking hands pointed toward a darkened hallway leading to a back room, and every inch of my training screamed that every detail mattered in piecing together this grim puzzle. As I escorted the distressed man toward a more secure area of the farmhouse, I couldn't help but notice how the building seemed to shift under the weight of the darkness outside. A creak here, a distant thud there. The sounds weren't just products of an old structure settling. They carried an unnerving, almost intentional cadence that set my nerves on edge. Outside, the torrential rain blurred the boundary between the physical and the surreal, as lightning illuminated brief snapshots of motion beyond the broken windows. I paused by one such window and caught a glimpse of what appeared to be silhouettes moving in the fields, a slow, deliberate pacing that resembled both human and something altogether unnatural. My radio crackled to life once again. Unit 14, maintain a safe distance. Suspect description matches local reports of unidentified wanderers. Exercise extreme caution. On Nocta Yedi, I acknowledged the message even as I wrestled with the possibility that this incident, like the one on Oak Ridge, was part of a larger pattern. A series of disturbances that defied normal explanation. In the farmhouse's isolation, I documented every detail, my notebook filling up with precise observations, the exact time stamps of each sound, the specific directions of movements, and every coded message transmitted over the radio. My every word echoed in the dim light as I interviewed the man, whose fragmented recollections painted an image of an unseen force, a presence that had haunted him before, urging him toward the fields, whispering his name in voices that sounded almost familiar. I heard them say, "Come home, Mark," over and over. He finally managed, in a trembling monotone that sent a chill through my spine. The name struck me like a jolt. I couldn't recall any recent incident involving that name, yet it resonated with a disturbing familiarity. I reassured him softly, "It's all right. You're safe here now. We're going to figure this out." Even as I spoke, the farmhouse seemed to breathe around us. Every creak and groan a reminder that some places carried ghosts not of the past, but of unfinished, unresolved tragedies. Backup arrived amid the relentless storm. A squad of fellow officers and a couple of detectives accustomed to the grit and grind of real emergencies. Their presence brought a temporary order to the chaos, but behind the professional veneer, each of us shared a palpable sense of disquiet. We scoured the farmhouse together, methodically covering every inch with flashlights and scanning for evidence of the spectral warnings that had already rattled me. In a locked cabinet, we discovered a bundle of old letters and photographs documenting a series of mysterious disappearances from the area decades ago. The letters spoke of strange rituals, warnings from a woman named Evelyn, whose words now echoed from the trembling notebooks of Oak Ridge and the desperate whispers in Blackwood Lane. In that moment, the two cases converged into one haunting narrative, a series of calls and disturbances that transcended individual incidents and hinted at a malevolent continuity woven through Westwood's history. As the night dwindled, the farmhouse was cordoned off, and the distraught witness taken to a nearby hospital where detectives began formulating a theory that blended established criminal behavior with unexplained, almost paranormal elements. I sat in my patrol car outside, its engine a low hum against the ceaseless drum of rain. I replayed every coded message, every whispered report over the radio, and every terrified recounting of voices from beyond. There, in the solitude of that fleeting quiet, I realized that these were not merely isolated episodes, but deliberate signals from something, or someone, lurking in the margins of our everyday lives. And as the rain finally tapered off, leaving behind the slick reflections of a town haunted by its own secrets, I knew that whatever force was at work, it was relentless and far from finished with us. The following night, the calm before what I now feared was an inevitable storm had long since vanished into memory. I found myself once again roaming the streets of Westwood, driven by a duty I couldn't escape, even as dread seeped into every fiber of my being. The radio lights blinked in rapid succession as I received yet another call, a distressed 911 report coming in from the heart of Westwood at 0320 hours. A new scene had unfolded at 216 Meadowbrook Drive, an area known for its tidy lawns and carefully maintained sidewalks, a far cry from the dilapidated properties I'd been investigating over the last 2 nights. This time, however, the call was marked with an urgency that sent shivers down my spine. Multiple calls reporting strange occurrences, a possible hostage situation inside a residence, suspect identified as an unknown male, heavily distraught. Over, I acknowledged. Unit 14, copy, en route, though every instinct told me that this wasn't an ordinary domestic disturbance. The backdrop of previous incidents, the haunted whispers on Oak Ridge, the shifting menace at Blackwood, gave this call a weight I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Arriving at Meadowbrook, I was immediately struck by the eerie juxtaposition of order and chaos. The quiet neighborhood, bathed in the gentle glow of streetlights and the soft hum of suburban life, hid a secret behind one of its pristine, well-kept houses. The address, 216 Meadowbrook Drive, sat incongruously on a wide, manicured street lined with identical 2-story homes. As I approached the front door, my radio repeated the dispatch instructions. Maintain communication. Proceed with extreme caution, 10:33. I knocked, and an agonizing silence followed for several long seconds before the door creaked open. A terrified woman, disheveled and trembling, met my gaze. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face the picture of someone who had seen something unimaginable. "Officer, they won't let me go," she gasped between stuttered breaths, clutching a small child to her chest, as if they were both the only anchors in a spiraling nightmare. I immediately assessed the situation, radioing in clear instructions to backup units. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14 at Meadowbrook Drive. We have a possible hostage scenario. Request immediate tactical team and a negotiator. Suspect is barricaded inside. I repeat, immediate response needed. Over." I gestured for the woman to come outside, her pale face a canvas of desperation and relief as she stepped into the cool night air. The child whimpered softly behind her, eyes darting around in confusion. In a hushed, measured tone, meant to soothe yet command attention, I said, "You're safe now. I need you to get away from the door. Can you tell me what happened?" Her voice was a shaky whisper laden with terror. He came out of nowhere, screaming. I tried to lock the door, but he broke it down. I heard him say things about making everything right. Then, the voices, they wouldn't stop. Her eyes glistened with tears as she recalled the incident, and I took careful notes, every detail important. The clock on my dashboard read 3:07, and the suburban calm was irrevocably shattered by the dark undertones of her account. Inside the house, the situation was as disorienting as it was dangerous. I could hear the man's heavy breathing, the muffled sounds of movement, and sporadically a low, guttural murmur, as if he were conversing with unseen forces. I led the woman and her child to a safe distance while my radio crackled with updates from my fellow officers. Unit 14, maintain 10-4. Negotiator en route. The radio confirmed in a clipped tone that reminded me how these procedures were drilled into us, even if the reality felt anything but routine. I circled the property, eyes scanning every shadow, every window illuminated by the occasional flash from a passing car or a distant lightning strike. Inside, the remnants of normalcy. Family photos, children's drawings, were littered with signs of recent violence. A broken chair, overturned tables, and a trail of blood leading to a locked door suggested that the situation had escalated quickly. As I waited for the tactical team, I maintained a constant line of communication with the dispatch, recounting every coded observation. Unit 14, negative visual on suspect, positive auditory on multiple distress calls, requesting containment and perimeter control. Over. Time seemed to stretch indefinitely, as every minute was charged with apprehension. The negotiator's voice, steady yet empathetic, finally came through the radio, attempting to engage the suspect in dialogue. I paused, hanging on to each word as the conversation unfolded. The man's responses were erratic, alternating between incoherent ramblings and moments of chilling clarity. His voice, distorted by fear and anger, echoed through the thin walls of the house. "They said I must do it. They're coming for me," he insisted in a tone that sounded both desperate and deranged, leaving me to wonder if he was more a victim of his own fractured mind than a mere criminal. As negotiations dragged on and backup secured the perimeter, I couldn't shake the feeling that the elements at play here were connected to the previous night's encounters. The same disembodied voices, the inexplicable presence that haunted the Oak Ridge and Blackwood cases. The eerie similarity, down to the specific phrasing of whispered warnings, was too marked to be dismissed as mere coincidence. When the tactical team finally breached the home at 3:45 a.m., the scene that unfolded was one of chaotic confusion and heart-stopping tension. Amid shouts and commands, officers carefully navigated the debris-strewn interior, and the suspect, ravenous with paranoia, made a final, desperate bid for escape that ended in a standoff marked by a chilling silence, punctuated only by heavy breathing. In the aftermath, as the man was taken into custody and the woman and child consoled by paramedics, I was left with a disquieting question. What was the underlying message in these calls, these violent yet ritualistic disturbances? My report that night was laden not only with the details of the unfolding crisis, but also with my own unspoken doubts about whether these incidents were rooted in criminal behavior or something altogether more sinister, a force that defied the boundaries of our conventional understanding of danger. Weeks passed, and the investigations into Oak Ridge, Blackwood, and Meadowbrook began to reveal unsettling overlaps. I found myself poring over records at the precinct, my desk cluttered with witness statements, security footage still marred by static, and transcripts of countless coded radio exchanges. Every piece of evidence was meticulously logged, every minor detail scrutinized. I began to notice a pattern. Each incident seemed to pivot around a central theme, a whisper of an almost spectral origin, a signature phrase uttered in a moment of sheer terror. The recordings were unsettlingly similar. A cold, metallic undertone would precede the man's desperate pleas, a background hum that no technician could explain away. Colleagues from various shifts mentioned that they had heard unsettling, garbled messages on their radios on separate nights, messages that seemed to warn of an impending reckoning, or, conversely, to beckon someone toward a fate they could not escape. Late one night, as I sat in the quiet solitude of the evidence room, re-listening to the fragmented recordings, a knock on the door startled me. It was Detective Lisa Monroe, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for her calm demeanor even under the most harrowing circumstances. "Mark," she said softly, closing the door behind her, "I think you need to see this." She pulled out an old case file from a dusty archive, a case that had been officially closed nearly 30 years ago, yet its contents were eerily relevant. The file documented a series of unsolved disturbances in Westwood that bore the exact hallmarks of the recent incidents: unexplained voices, inexplicable break-ins, and, most disturbingly, the recurring mention of the name Mark in one of the victims' testimonies. My blood ran cold as I realized that the file detailed an incident involving a young police officer named Mark, whose disappearance had never been resolved. As Detective Monroe quietly recounted the details, I felt a surreal connection between the past and the present, a truth that seemed to transcend the linear confines of time. "Maybe," she said in a measured tone that belied the storm of emotions beneath, "these events aren't random at all. They're following a blueprint, one that we may have been unwilling to acknowledge." In that dim, hushed space, as the evidence of past and present converged, I began to understand that the true horror wasn't in the isolated events, but in the macabre continuity that linked them. A continuity that might even implicate people like me in destinies we never chose. By the time dawn broke over Westwood once more, the storm had cleared, but its emotional residue remained. A lingering, unshakable sense of foreboding that I carried with me as I continued my duty. Every call, every coded message on the radio, every whispered warning in the dark pressed upon my mind with an intensity I couldn't easily dismiss. And as I drove the familiar streets, the once routine landscape now appeared fraught with hidden perils. Every quiet cul-de-sac and abandoned lot whispered of secrets best left undisturbed. In the quiet moments between shifts, I found myself haunted by the possibility that what we were witnessing was not the product of a deranged mind or a random act of violence, but something far more insidious, something that had been laying in wait, meticulously orchestrating events over decades, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Even now, I can't help but ask in the solitude of the night, what if the true horror isn't in the disturbances we report on 911, but in the inevitable reckoning that awaits us all? That question, like the echo of those cryptic warnings, lingers in the corridors of my mind, an ever-present reminder that some mysteries, once uncovered, refuse to remain buried. The final hours of that investigation left me with more questions than answers. A deep unease began to gnaw at me as I attempted to reconcile the ordinary nature of police work with the extraordinary phenomena I had encountered. Amid the logistical reports and follow-up interviews, one element stood out with unnerving clarity: the presence of that haunting, disembodied voice, echoing through the intercom of my life like a dirge for the lost. My once firm belief in the rational world of evidence and procedure had been cracked open, leaving me vulnerable to notions I would have once dismissed as superstition. At a late-night briefing at the station, I found myself alone with a cup of black coffee, as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and I replayed the recordings for the umpteenth time. Each iteration of that garbled message, "They're inside, the walls, don't let them in," seemed to carry a weight that transcended mortal urgency, as if it were a final, desperate plea from something that had been imprisoned in the shadowy recesses of Westwood's past. I wondered if, perhaps, these voices were not warnings at all, but invitations, calls to rejoin a chorus of souls who had vanished long before our modern age. Each unanswered question deepened the chasm between what I knew as fact and what I might have to accept as the unexplainable truth. In the weeks following the intense night at Meadowbrook, an unspoken shift occurred both within the precinct and in the community at large. The stark realism of our investigations, the detailed police logs, the procedure-driven radio traffic, the documented evidence, remained our steadfast anchor in a world that was increasingly slipping into realms of inexplicable phenomena. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite greetings now spoke in hushed tones about the incidents, their voices weighted with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Small business owners bolted their shop doors at dusk, and even the local diner, usually a hub of camaraderie and mundane chatter, seemed to have a shadow of apprehension about its regular patrons. In every whispered conversation and furtive glance, I could sense that the fabric of our seemingly ordinary lives had been irreparably altered by the cascade of events that began with that fateful 911 call. I would spend long, restless nights pacing the floors of my apartment, rehashing every detail of that corridor of chaos, wondering if I was now part of a narrative that extended far beyond the controlled lines of police procedure. One evening, as I was closing up my locker at the station, my partner, Officer Ramirez, caught me staring into the darkened silence of the evidence board, where photographs, sketches, and handwritten notes were tacked with almost ritualistic precision. "You all right, Mark?" he asked, his voice low and laced with the concern of someone who had seen too many nights like this. I hesitated, then replied, "I'm not sure, Ramirez. Sometimes I wonder if all these calls, they're more than just random tragedies. It's like they're connected, like we're living in the middle of something that defies all normal explanation." His eyes met mine in a silent acknowledgement that the unspoken burden of those words was shared. "Maybe some things are better left unsaid," he murmured, his tone as heavy as the late autumn air outside. I simply nodded, knowing that beneath his pragmatic exterior lay the same fragile human spirit, battered by the inexorable persistence of the inexplicable. We parted ways that night with a lingering sense of melancholy, the weight of our experiences pressing upon us like the dark, relentless night that had become all too familiar. Now, as I write these words in the quiet aftermath of those tumultuous weeks, I can't help but replay every moment. The rain-soaked roads, the urgent cadence of the radio messages, the haunted eyes of the people I encountered, and I am left with an unshakable question. Was all of it real? Was it all a series of unfortunate events compounded by coincidence, or was there something deliberately sinister orchestrating these disturbances? Every time I hear the static crackle of the dispatch, I remember that night when a voice, barely audible through the walls of an abandoned farmhouse, said, "They're inside. Don't let them in." And even now, as I sit in the solitude of a hospital waiting room during a night shift break, I wonder if the events that unfolded on Oak Ridge, Blackwood, and Meadowbrook were truly isolated incidents of human frailty, or if they were the echoes of a far more pervasive and malevolent design, one that continues to haunt us long after the call has ended, and leaves us questioning whether we should have listened at all. I never imagined that a routine night shift could unravel into a nightmare that would haunt me for years. I'd grown up in this part of California, quiet streets lined with aging maples, diner lights that glowed warmly in the dusk, and neighbors who greeted one another by name. My life as Officer Daniel Monroe had always felt safe and predictable, at least until that fateful autumn evening when a missing person call shattered everything I knew about this small town. I was patrolling a stretch of rural road on the outskirts of Redding when I received the dispatch. The voice on the radio trembled with panic as it relayed the unsettling news. Thomas Baker, a local handyman known for his friendly smile and reliable nature, had not returned home after his customary walk through the nearby woods. The urgency in the call pulled me away from the comforting hum of my cruiser's engine into a realm of uncertainty where every shadow could hide the unknown. Driving through the winding country roads, I mentally prepared for the search ahead. The night was already darkening, and a chilling wind swept through the barren fields. I reached Baker's modest home, a weathered farmhouse tucked behind a screen of towering pines, and was greeted by his wife, Linda, whose eyes mirrored the terror that simmered beneath her composed exterior. Linda explained in a halting voice that Thomas had left around dusk for his routine evening walk along a trail that led to a nearby creek. His disappearance, she insisted, was unlike anything that ever happened in our tight-knit community. I reassured her that I would do everything in my power to bring him home, and with that promise lingering in the heavy air, I set out into the forest. The woods that night were an oppressive maze of gnarled branches and flickering shadows, the soft rustle of leaves mingling with the silence of the absent fauna. I advanced cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing nervously over the undergrowth as I called out Thomas's name. Nothing answered except the eerie echo of my voice ricocheting off the dense trunks. Every step I took seemed to immerse me deeper into a realm where the familiar became alien, and the comforting sounds of nature were replaced by a suffocating quiet. I radioed in for backup, and soon my partner, Officer Marcus Reed, joined me. Marcus was a steady presence, his laughter and wry remarks often a counterbalance to my own tendencies to overthink. But that night, his usual confidence was overshadowed by the palpable unease that clung to the trees like thick mist. We combed the trail systematically, our flashlights cutting through the darkness in search of even the smallest hint. A stray hat, a broken branch, footprints in the damp soil. Hours passed with nothing but the relentless suspicion that Thomas had simply vanished into the night. Our only break came with the discovery of his worn cap near the creek's edge, half buried in mud and leaves. Its presence was a silent testament to his presence, yet offered no clear clue as to where he had gone. Back at the station, I spent sleepless hours reviewing the case files and interviewing residents, each statement painting an image of Thomas as a man who cherished his solitary walks and thrived on the quiet solitude of nature. But as the days bled into nights, with the case stubbornly unresolved, disjointed whispers began to circulate. A rumor that more than one person had disappeared in these woods over the years, each case as inexplicable as the last. Those murmurs gnawed at me, urging me to look deeper and trust my instincts even when the hard evidence was frustratingly elusive. The investigation took on an almost obsessive dimension. Every spare moment, every quiet midnight hour away from the sterile, fluorescent lights of the station, I returned to that trail. I retraced every step, determined to find what my colleagues and I had missed. The deeper I ventured, the more the forest revealed a hidden life of secrets and decay. A fallen tree carpeted with fungus, abandoned campsites long reclaimed by nature, and subtle signs that someone had been there recently, despite the official records showing no activity for years. My nights were tormented by a creeping sense of dread and isolation. In the quiet of those endless hours, I began to question my own perceptions. Had I simply failed to see what was right before me, or was there something in those woods that defied explanation? The pressure of uncertainty and the weight of responsibility grew heavier with each passing night, driving me to a breaking point that I'd never anticipated. During one particularly bitter evening, when the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and the dense canopy above seemed to suffocate any hints of starlight, I discovered something extraordinary. Hidden beneath a tangle of vines and debris was a narrow, overgrown path, a route that my previous patrols had missed entirely. The road led to a dilapidated structure camouflaged by nature's relentless reclaiming grip. Its wooden facade was pocked by time, with broken windows and a sagging roof barely clinging to the structure. There was an inexplicable pull that urged me to explore further, despite every instinct screaming caution. With my heart pounding in my chest, I stepped across the threshold of that forsaken place. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of decay and forgotten memories, and the dim light from my flashlight danced across peeling walls covered in cryptic scribbles and faded photographs. I quickly began to understand that this was no mere abandoned shack. It was a repository of secrets, a silent witness to the countless disappearances that had plagued these woods. I left the cabin with a copy of my discovery secured in my phone's memory, feeling the weight of impending doom press down on me. The next morning, I briefed my commanding officer with the evidence, but my words seemed to dissolve into a haze of dismissive nods and bureaucratic indifference. "Probably just an old hideout," the chief had said, encouraging me to set the matter aside. But that night, as I sat alone in my living room with the remnants of an unsatisfying dinner staring back at me through the half-light of a street lamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. The farmhouse, the trail, the hidden cabin, all wove together a tapestry of despair and forbidden knowledge. I began to feel as if the very land was whispering dark secrets, urging me to uncover the truth even if it meant confronting the darkest corners of my own soul. I returned to the decaying cabin once more, this time armed with the resolve of a man who has nothing left to lose. The night was oppressively quiet, the only sound the crunch of my footsteps on brittle autumn leaves. Inside, each creak and groan of the weathered floorboards amplified my heightened senses. I scrutinized every detail: the cracked porcelain of a long-forgotten coffee mug, the layers of dust that obscured once vibrant photographs strewn across a rickety table. In one far corner, beneath a threadbare rug, I discovered a trapdoor cleverly concealed in plain sight. My heart thundered in my chest as I knelt down and pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into a suffocating darkness. With a deep breath and a steadying thought that I owed nothing less than the truth to Thomas Baker and all the others lost in these woods, I began my descent. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing like a mournful drum in the oppressive silence. At the bottom, I found myself in a cramped tunnel, its walls slick with moisture and stained with the remnants of decay. I advanced slowly, my flashlight struggling to penetrate the inky blackness, revealing only a tortuous passageway that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. The air grew colder and more oppressive, as if the very essence of the tunnel was siphoning away my warmth and hope. In that confined space, every sound, the drip of water, the scuttle of unseen creatures, became magnified, feeding the gnawing terror in my gut. After what felt like an eternity, the narrow corridor opened into a makeshift chamber, its walls covered in a disturbing array of photographs, newspaper clippings, and scribbled notes that chronicled a series of long-forgotten disappearances. In the center of the room sat a metal chair, its existence a stark, jarring contrast to the decaying surroundings. There, bound tightly and gagged with what looked like strips of old cloth, was Thomas Baker. His eyes, wide with both terror and relief, locked onto mine as though pleading for salvation. I rushed to unfasten the restraints, my hands trembling with adrenaline and a burgeoning sense of dread. As soon as he was freed, he murmured incoherently, his voice raw and pained. I helped him to his feet, and together we navigated the dark labyrinth, every step fueled by the desperate hope of escape. Emerging from the tunnel felt like bursting through the surface of the water, after being submerged for too long. The pale light of dawn had begun to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest floor as we made our way back to the clearing. My mind was reeling from the confrontation with the unspeakable horrors hidden beneath that forsaken cabin. The relief of having rescued Thomas was quickly eclipsed by the lingering question: who, or what, had orchestrated this macabre prison beneath the woods? And more chilling still was the realization that as long as the dark underbelly of this forest remained, our community was in mortal peril. In the days that followed, the case took on an eerie intensity. The station was abuzz with whispers and speculation, and even the most stoic of my colleagues could not hide the shadow of dread that now hung over our once placid town. Thomas, still in a fragile state of recovery, could barely recall fragments of his ordeal, his eyes haunted by memories that he dared not voice. Each detail he did mention: the cold, damp fear in the tunnel, the desperate, haunting sound that seemed to beckon him deeper, only added to the sinister puzzle that we were forced to piece together. I spent countless nights poring over the evidence, desperate to uncover a pattern or a motive, but every lead seemed to spiral into deeper uncertainty, leaving me with more questions than answers. One evening, while meticulously re-examining the photographs and clippings from the underground chamber, I noticed a detail that sent a chill down my spine. Amidst the images of lost souls, a faded, cryptic symbol repeatedly appeared, a symbol I had seen before in an old case file that documented a series of disappearances dating back decades. The realization that this pattern of abductions spanned far beyond our modern era shook me to the core. Was this evidence of a deranged individual's long-standing vendetta, or was it something far more sinister, woven into the fabric of our very community's history? The thought that such darkness could fester unseen for so long left me questioning not only the motives of the perpetrator, but also my own role as a guardian of the very people I had sworn to protect. The investigation soon attracted the attention of local media, and a series of candid interviews turned my routine life into a public spectacle. Under the stark glare of flashbulbs, I recounted every harrowing moment of that night, each step into the unknown, every heart-stopping moment in the tunnel, and the unearthly terror that had gripped me as I stared down the eyes of a madness that defied explanation. Even as I recounted these events, I could sense that the truth was slipping through my fingers like so many whispered secrets. Every interview, every new piece of evidence, seemed to only further entrench the mystery deep into a labyrinth of psychological torment and unrelenting despair. In the wake of these revelations, I began to perceive a creeping presence in every shadow I passed, a distant echo of the unspeakable horror that lingered beneath the surface of my everyday routine. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, making even the simplest tasks feel monumental. I started to experience sleepless nights punctuated by nightmares of that claustrophobic tunnel and the sight of Thomas's terrified eyes. The comforting routines of my life, patrolling familiar streets, sharing a quiet drink after a shift, had all been irrevocably altered. The specter of that long, dark night seeped into every fiber of my being, leaving behind a sense of unease that I could neither shake nor understand. As months passed, the case slowly began to settle into a semblance of routine. The criminal was identified, a drifter with a murky past and a documented history of mental instability. Yet his capture did little to alleviate the lingering terror that had taken root in our small town. With him behind bars, one would expect closure. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. How could such calculated cruelty hide beneath the veneer of normalcy for so long? And what of the symbolic mark that recurred in every piece of evidence? A silent testament to a darkness that might never be fully vanquished. On one particularly stormy night, as rain battered the windows of my modest apartment, and thunder roared like a vengeful spirit outside, I found myself drawn back to the very forest that had changed my life. In a moment of wild, inexplicable compulsion, I took my cruiser and headed toward the woods, the rhythmic beat of the raindrops on the roof of my car offering a grim, steady counterpoint to my racing thoughts. My mind was preoccupied with a question that I could no longer ignore. Was the terror confined solely to that decrepit cabin and its underground secrets, or had it seeped into the very soul of our town? The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that this case was but the tip of a much larger, more insidious phenomenon, one that challenged the very boundaries of my understanding, leaving me to wonder if I had truly seen the depths of the darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface. I parked near the edge of the forest, the engine of my cruiser ticking down as if marking the final seconds before fate intervened. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and decay, and every step on the slick ground filled me with a foreboding that made my hands tremble on my holster. I took a deep breath and stepped into the tempestuous night once more, determined to confront whatever lay ahead, even as the unanswerable questions gnawed relentlessly at my sanity. The forest was no longer just a place of quiet refuge. It had transformed into a living monument to despair and unresolved secrets. A place where every whisper of the wind might be a voice from the abyss, calling out my name. Days melted into nights as I meticulously retraced the steps of that horrifying journey. I interviewed witnesses, re-examined old case files, and even sought the counsel of a retired detective famed for his uncanny insight into cases that defied logic. Each conversation, every scrap of evidence, led me deeper into a labyrinth of conspiracy and twisted fate. I became increasingly haunted by a series of visions, fleeting, barely perceptible images of faceless figures and obscure symbols, while every reflective surface reminded me that the darkness I sought to banish had now taken root within me. It was as if the deeper I delved into the mystery of the disappearances, the more I was drawn into an inescapable vortex of psychological torment and existential dread. There was no turning back. The forest had become a mirror to my own soul, revealing the raw, unfiltered terror of confronting the unknown. In my sleepless state, I began to document every detail in a tattered journal, my pen scratching out the words with a fervor that bordered on desperation. I recorded my conversations with witnesses, my internal monologues during the long drives between case sites, and even the fleeting moments when I felt an unseen presence watching my every move. Every entry became a testament to the relentless pressure I felt, a silent scream against the encroaching void that threatened to engulf me. Yet, even as I penned these accounts, I sensed that there was still more to uncover, a final piece to a puzzle that was as incomplete as it was maddeningly complex.